There's a moment in Season 1 where Morty falls into a pile of alien creatures and screams so hard his voice literally cracks mid-shriek. Most people laugh and move on, but I rewatched that moment about 14 times. And here's the thing, it's not the scream that got me, it's what happens right after. He gets up, he keeps going, he follows Rick without saying a word about it. Like getting buried in alien flesh is just Tuesday. That bugged me, because by Season 5, Morty doesn't scream like that anymore. Not even close. He's been in situations that are objectively worse. War crimes, deaths, body horror that would make a horror director wince, and he just handles it. So either the writers forgot how to write Morty, or something happened to him. And I think it's the second one. I went through every season, every major scream, every moment where Morty reacts with raw, unfiltered terror versus the moments where he goes quiet. And what I found is that the screams aren't random. They aren't just comedy beats. They're actually a really precise record of how much of himself Morty has lost. The show never announces this. Rick and Morty doesn't do that. It just puts it in the frame and expects you to notice. Most people don't notice. I noticed. So let's talk about it. The kid who couldn't stop screaming. Season 1. Morty is terrified of basically everything. And look, that's fair. If I was 14 years old and my grandfather showed up with a portal gun and started dragging me across dimensions before breakfast, I'd have concerns too. But Morty's fear in Season 1 isn't just, this is new and scary. It's deeper than that. It's the specific fear of someone who has no control over anything happening to him and understands it completely. He's not dumb, is the thing. That's a mistake people make about early Morty. He gets called an idiot constantly, mostly by Rick, but his fear response actually shows pretty sophisticated situational awareness. He knows when things are bad, he knows when they're getting worse. He screams because his body is recognizing danger that his mind can't figure out how to process yet. Take the very first episode, Pilot. Rick shows up, half drunk, claims to have a bomb that'll destroy humanity, drags Morty out of bed in the middle of the night, and takes him to an alien planet where the seeds Morty has to smuggle back. The screaming starts almost immediately. But here's what I want you to notice. The scream in the pilot isn't a scream of, I don't understand what's happening. Morty understands exactly what's happening. He screams because he understands, and he can't do anything about it. That's a crucial distinction. He's not confused. He's helpless. There's a difference. And the helplessness in that first scream sets up everything that follows in Season 1. Almost every scream in the first season has that same quality. Something is happening. Morty knows it's bad. He can't stop it. He screams. Sometimes he gets through it. Sometimes Rick saves him. Sometimes he saves himself in a panicky, barely functional way. But the scream is always the first response. Always. Before thinking, before acting, before anything. It's pure reflex. And that's actually really important because by the end of the series, the reflex is mostly gone. But we're not there yet. Right now we're at the beginning, and the beginning is a kid who reacts to danger the way most kids would react to danger. He loses his mind. Lawnmower Dog has a great example of this. Morty enters the dream of his math teacher, Mr. Goldenfold, and what he finds in there is escalating layers of nightmare logic. Goldenfold's dreams within dreams within dreams, each one stranger and more threatening than the last. And Morty spends most of the episode reacting to each new development with complete, genuine panic. He's not performing fear, he's not doing a bit. He is scared, specifically and freshly, every single time something new goes wrong. The screams in that episode are almost rhythmic. New threat, scream. New threat, scream. Rick gives a sarcastic response. New threat, scream. It becomes funny because of the repetition. But the thing is, it's also really honest. Real fear doesn't stop after the first scare. If you're genuinely terrified, each new thing is genuinely frightening. The nervous system doesn't build up much of a callus after 45 minutes in a nightmare. Morty's responses are actually the normal ones. Rick's calm is the weird one. That's something the show is doing on purpose. Rick's lack of reaction makes Morty's reaction look immature and exaggerated. But strip Rick out of the frame, and Morty looks completely reasonable. A kid in a nightmare is supposed to panic. That's what humans do. What the show is quietly building toward is a version of Morty where he stops doing the human thing. But Season 1 isn't there yet. Me Seeks and Destroy is probably the most straightforward fear scream of the entire first season. Morty makes a bet with Rick. Let Morty lead an adventure for once. And what follows is Morty trying to play hero while progressively losing control of the situation. He wants to slay a giant. He wants to feel capable, and he doesn't feel capable because he isn't capable yet. The adventure falls apart. Things get dangerous in ways Morty didn't anticipate. He screams a lot. But there's something else in that episode that's worth noticing. Mr. Jellybean. If you've seen the episode, you know what happened. If you haven't, don't read too much about it, just watch it. But after what happens with Mr. Jellybean, Morty goes quiet in a way that's different from his usual scared silent moments. He's not processing fear, he's processing something else. Something that doesn't have a scream attached to it. That's the first hint that Morty's emotional range is bigger than just scared. There are things that happen to him that make him go silent instead of loud. That's going to matter. Rick Potion #9 is where things get genuinely dark for the first time. Morty asks Rick for a love potion for his crush, Jessica. It goes wrong in the most Rick and Morty way possible. Cascading mutation events that eventually turn the entire human population on Earth into grotesque Morty-obsessed monsters. And then into praying mantis creatures. And then into what the show calls Cronenbergs. And then Rick just gives up on the planet. He finds a reality where they already solved it and then promptly died. He buries those versions of himself and Morty. And the two of them just move in. The scream in that episode isn't the loudest one in season 1, but it might be the most important. Because when Morty sees his own dead body, when he sees himself decomposing in a garbage bag, being tossed into a backyard grave, the scream he lets out isn't fear, it's existential. It's something breaking. He wasn't supposed to see that. Nobody's supposed to see that. And what happens next is Morty sitting in front of a campfire, telling his sister Beth's friend about burying himself. Telling someone the real thing that happened. Not for laughs. Just because he needs to say it out loud to someone. Because he doesn't know how else to carry it. Season 1. Morty screams when he's scared. But he also cracks when the weight gets too heavy. And Rick Potion #9 is the first time the weight gets too heavy. It won't be the last. Chapter 2. The Anatomy of a Scream. Here's a thing that sounds obvious but is worth saying out loud. Not all screams are the same. That sounds basic. But once you start paying attention to it in the show, you realize how much work is actually being done by the type of scream, not just whether a scream happens. Justin Roiland, who voiced both Rick and Morty for the first 7 seasons, had a specific range for Morty's screams, and they genuinely communicate different things. The writers knew it, the animators knew it, you can feel the difference even if you've never consciously tried to analyze it. There's the panic scream. That's the most common one in season 1. High, breathless, usually accompanied by flailing arms and some variation of Rick, Rick, Rick. It's the scream of someone who has zero context for what's happening and needs an adult immediately. The energy of it is almost childlike in a very specific way. It's the kind of scream where you're not trying to communicate anything, you're just making the loudest sound you can because your body has made the decision that screaming is the appropriate response to immediate physical danger. This scream usually gets a sarcastic response from Rick. Rick has heard it enough that he's basically stopped processing it as meaningful information. Then, there's the disgust scream. This is the one where Morty sees something viscerally wrong. Wrong body parts, wrong fluids, wrong configurations of matter, and his whole body recoils before his brain is involved. This scream has a different texture than the panic scream. It's shorter, sharper, and usually followed by physical movement away from whatever caused it. There's a specific episode in Season 1, Anatomy Park, where Morty gets shrunk and sent inside a man's body, and the disgust screams in that episode are almost rhythmic. Something gross, scream. Something grosser, bigger scream. Something that would genuinely traumatize a medical professional. Morty just goes completely silent for a second because his reaction system has overloaded. The silence after a disgust scream is actually funnier than the scream. Roiland understood that. Then there's what I'd call the helpless scream. This one's different from the panic scream because the panic scream happens when things are going wrong and might get worse. The helpless scream happens when Morty already knows things are bad and he can't do anything about it. It's lower in pitch, it's more sustained, it has a hopeless quality to it, like the scream itself isn't even expecting a response. It's just a sound his body makes because there's no other outlet. Rick Potion #9 has a great helpless scream when Morty watches his original home dimension just fall apart around them. When he understands that this isn't a problem Rick is going to solve. When he realizes that the life he had is just gone. That scream has no audience. He's not screaming at Rick. He's not screaming at Rick. He's not screaming at Rick. He's screaming because there's nothing else to do. And then there's the angry scream. We don't get this one much in season 1. It shows up a little in the finale, in flashes, but it becomes much more common later. The angry scream is when Morty's fear has converted into something harder and louder. When the thing he's scared of becomes something he wants to push back against instead of just escape from. The transition from scared screams to angry screams is actually one of the most precise charts of Morty's development in the entire series. But there's one more type of scream worth naming. The fake scream. This one doesn't appear until later in the series, but it's the most devastating one when it does. The fake scream is when Morty does something scream-shaped. He makes the right sound, his face does the right thing, but it doesn't come from a real place. It's performance. It's a kid who's learned what the scared response is supposed to look like and is doing an impression of it. The fake scream is where you know something went really wrong. We'll come back to it. For now, just keep these categories in mind. Because when you watch season 1, and most of what you're hearing is genuine panic screams and helpless screams, and then you watch season 4 or 5 and you're hearing angry screams and occasional fake screams, and sometimes no scream at all, you'll understand exactly what that shift means. The voice changed because the person changed. And not in a good way. Chapter 3. The first scream that wasn't fear. Something Ricked This Way Comes is a season 1 episode that people mostly remember for the Mr. Needful subplot. The devil who runs an antique shop where everything he sells has a curse attached to it, and Summer works for him. Rick versus the devil is genuinely funny and the episode is solid, but there's a moment in it that I don't think people talk about enough. And it doesn't actually involve a scream. It involves the absence of one. Morty and his actual grandfather on his dad's side go through a thing in this episode where they get bullied, and they stand up for themselves, and they beat the people up. And Morty's reaction during the fight is something worth examining. Because Morty doesn't scream during the fight. He grunts, he hits back, he engages. In season 1, episode 9. And then afterwards, there's a satisfaction on his face that isn't there in the aftermath of the scared screams. When Morty gets through a terrifying adventure and the scream is over, what's usually left is relief. Pure relief. He made it. Rick saved him, or he saved himself, or something random happened and the danger passed, and he breathes out. But after the fight, what's on his face is something different. He feels good. That's new. And it's worth sitting with. Because what Something Ricked This Way Comes is quietly establishing is that Morty has a side that doesn't respond to threat with panic. He also has a side that responds to threat with aggression. And that side feels different in his body. It doesn't produce the breathless, cracking scream of, "Rick, Rick, help me." It produces something steadier and harder and, in some ways, scarier. Because the panicked, screaming Morty is a kid who wants someone else to make the bad things stop. The Morty who throws a punch without screaming is a kid who's starting to decide he might be the one who makes things stop. That shift doesn't fully land in season 1. It's a hint. The episode mostly plays it for laughs. Roided up Rick and Morty walking down the street. Triumphant music, the camera lingering on their beefy makeovers. It's a gag. But the gag contains real information. Now, the first scream in the show that I would genuinely classify as not fear, not disgust, not helplessness, not panic, comes earlier than you might expect. It's in Me Seeks and Destroy, and it's the scream Morty lets out when he finds the courage to stand up to the giant. On its surface, it looks like a fear scream. He's terrified. His voice cracks. The whole thing, but the context is different. He's not running from something, he's running towards something. He came up with the plan. He's executing the plan. He's scared, yes, but the scream is coming from a place of action, not reaction. Fear screams are reactive. This scream is almost determined. It's tiny, it's early, it barely registers, but I think it's the first moment where Morty's scream contains something other than pure terror. There's something in there that wants to win, and you can't unhear it once you notice. Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind is a season 1 episode that I want to spend some time on because it does something genuinely interesting with Morty's emotional range. The Evil Rick episode, where Rick is framed for killing other Ricks and they go on the run and we learn about the Morty Farms. The Morty Farms. Okay, so The Council of Ricks has been kidnapping Mortys and using them as camouflage for evil Ricks, because the genius of a Rick is so loud that it disrupts the tracking systems, and a Morty's brain creates a kind of dead zone that hides the Rick signal. The implication being that Mortys are being used as shields, as equipment, their brains, their innocence, their anxiety, literally functioning as hiding places. Morty finds this out, and his reaction is not a scream, it's silence. A deep, quiet kind of silence that's more disturbing than any scream he's had up to that point. Because what he's processing isn't, "This is immediately dangerous to me." What he's processing is, "I have been a tool this whole time and I might have always known it." That silence is worth more than 100 panic screams in terms of what it tells you about where the character is going. And then after the silence, after the weight of that information has settled, Morty has a conversation with Rick about whether Rick actually cares about him. And Rick's response is the, "I like to imagine the end of the road" speech. Rick talks about how he always imagines a single road leading somewhere, and Morty is always ahead of him. And it's touching. It's one of the first genuinely touching moments in a show that was still figuring out how touching it wanted to be. But notice what Rick doesn't say. He doesn't say, "Yes, I care about you." He says, "I think about you a lot." He says, "There's always a Morty." And Morty smiles. Because at this point in the show, in Season 1, Morty still has enough hope and innocence to take the good faith reading of what Rick said. He hears, "I care about you," because he wants that to be true. Later versions of Morty would hear the ambiguity. But we're not there yet. Chapter 4, Season 2, and the scream that changed everything. Here's a thing that Season 2 does that Season 1 didn't do. It gets personal. Season 1 is scary and weird and dark, but the darkness is mostly external. Alien planets, monsters, scientific disasters. The threats are real, and they're big, and they're terrifying. But they're also kind of abstract. They don't come for Morty specifically. They come for whoever happens to be in the vicinity. Season 2 starts coming for Morty specifically. A Wrinkle in Time opens the season with the consequences of the Season 1 finale. Rick, Morty, and Summer have frozen time for 6 months while their parents went through their separation arc, and now time has been unfrozen and it's immediately unstable. The universe starts fracturing, and there's a moment where it looks like Morty is going to die. Specifically, where Morty sacrifices himself so Rick can survive, because Morty decides that Rick is more important than he is. Not more important than Morty's goals or desires. More important than his life. And the scream in that moment, when Morty thinks he's dying, when he's accepted it, is different from any Season 1 scream. It's not panicked. It's not helpless. It's resigned. There's something in Morty's voice in that moment that sounds like a kid who has decided he already knew it was going to end like this. Some part of him, at some point between Season 1 and Season 2, made peace with the idea that being around Rick might kill him. And when the moment comes, he doesn't fight it. He screams. But the scream doesn't ask for help. Rick saves him anyway. Rick gives up his own collar to keep the time crystal stable and saves Morty's life. And it's a huge moment for their relationship. Rick almost dies to save Morty. The machine that's supposed to fix it only has one dose. Rick chooses Morty. But here's the uncomfortable thing about that moment. Morty was ready to not be chosen. And nobody talks about that. Morty Night Run is a Season 2 episode that introduces a new dynamic to Morty's screaming. Rick has taken Morty to a space arcade while he does a weapons deal, and Morty discovers that one of the weapons Rick sold is going to be used to hunt down and kill a gaseous being named Fart. Morty decides to save Fart, and the adventure that follows is Morty making choices and dealing with consequences in a way that's different from Season 1. Because in Season 1, when things went wrong, Morty screamed and then adapted. In Morty Night Run, when things go wrong, Morty makes harder choices. Morty kills a guard. Not accidentally, not as a consequence of something else, but deliberately, because it's the only way through. And he screams after. That's the scream I want to talk about. The scream after the guard dies. That scream is the first true grief scream in the show. It's not fear, he's not in danger. The immediate problem is solved. But he screams because he just did something that can't be undone, and his body knows it before his brain has finished catching up. The scream is his nervous system trying to process a version of himself that he didn't have before that moment. There's a moment in Season 1 where Morty falls into a pile of alien creatures and screams so hard his voice literally cracks mid-shriek. Most people laugh and move on, but I rewatched that moment about 14 times. And here's the thing, it's not the scream that got me. It's what happens right after. He gets up, he keeps going, he follows Rick without saying a word about it. Like getting buried in alien flesh is just Tuesday. That bugged me, because by Season 5, by Season 6, Morty doesn't scream like that anymore. Not even close. He's been in situations that are objectively worse. War crimes, deaths, body horror that would make a horror director wince, and he just handles it. So either the writers forgot how to write Morty, or something happened to him. And I think it's the second one. I went through every season, every major scream, every moment where Morty reacts with raw, unfiltered terror versus the moments where he goes quiet. And what I found is that the screams aren't random. They aren't just comedy beats. They're actually a really precise record of how much of himself Morty has lost. The show never announces this. Rick and Morty doesn't do that. It just puts it in the frame and expects you to notice. Most people don't notice. I noticed. So let's talk about it. The kid who couldn't stop screaming. Season 1. Morty is terrified of basically everything. And look, that's fair. If I was 14 years old and my grandfather showed up with a portal gun and started dragging me across dimensions before breakfast, I'd have concerns too. But Morty's fear in Season 1 isn't just, this is new and scary. It's deeper than that. It's the specific fear of someone who has no control over anything happening to him and understands it completely. He's not dumb, is the thing. That's a mistake people make about early Morty. He gets called an idiot constantly, mostly by Rick, but his fear response actually shows pretty sophisticated situational awareness. He knows when things are bad, he knows when they're getting worse. He screams because his body is recognizing danger that his mind can't figure out how to process yet. Take the very first episode, Pilot. Rick shows up, half drunk, claims to have a bomb that'll destroy humanity, drags Morty out of bed in the middle of the night, and takes him to an alien planet where the seeds Morty has to smuggle back are inside alien creatures that Morty has to seduce. The screaming starts almost immediately. But here's what I want you to notice. The scream in the pilot isn't a scream of, I don't understand what's happening. Morty understands exactly what's happening. He screams because he understands, and he can't do anything about it. That's a crucial distinction. He's not confused. He's helpless. There's a difference. And the helplessness in that first scream sets up everything that follows in Season 1. Almost every scream in the first season has that same quality. Something is happening. Morty knows it's bad. He can't stop it. He screams. Sometimes he gets through it. Sometimes Rick saves him. Sometimes he saves himself in a panicky, barely functional way. But the scream is always the first response. Always. Before thinking. Before acting. Before anything. It's pure reflex. And that's actually really important because by the end of the series, the reflex is mostly gone. But we're not there yet. Right now we're at the beginning, and the beginning is a kid who reacts to danger the way most kids would react to danger. He loses his mind. Lawnmower Dog has a great example of this. Morty enters the dream of his math teacher, Mr. Goldenfold, and what he finds in there is escalating layers of nightmare logic. Goldenfold's dreams within dreams within dreams, each one stranger and more threatening than the last. And Morty spends most of the episode reacting to each new development with complete, genuine panic. He's not performing fear. He's not doing a bit. He is scared, specifically and freshly, every single time something new goes wrong. The screams in that episode are almost rhythmic. New threat. Scream. New threat. Scream. Rick gives a sarcastic response. New threat. Scream. It becomes funny because of the repetition. But the thing is, it's also really honest. Real fear doesn't stop after the first scare. If you're genuinely terrified, each new thing is genuinely frightening. The nervous system doesn't build up much of a callus after 45 minutes in a nightmare. Morty's responses are actually the normal ones. Rick's calm is the weird one. That's something the show is doing on purpose. Rick's lack of reaction makes Morty's reaction look immature and exaggerated. But strip Rick out of the frame, and Morty looks completely reasonable. A kid in a nightmare is supposed to panic. That's what humans do. What the show is quietly building toward is a version of Morty where he stops doing the human thing. But Season 1 isn't there yet. Me Seeks and Destroy is probably the most straightforward fear scream of the entire first season. Morty makes a bet with Rick. Let Morty lead an adventure for once. And what follows is Morty trying to play hero while progressively losing control of the situation. He wants to slay a giant. He wants to feel capable, and he doesn't feel capable because he isn't capable yet. The adventure falls apart. Things get dangerous in ways Morty didn't anticipate. He screams a lot. But there's something else in that episode that's worth noticing. Mr. Jellybean. If you've seen the episode, you know what happened. If you haven't, don't read too much about it, just watch it. But after what happens with Mr. Jellybean, Morty goes quiet in a way that's different from his usual scared silent moments. He's not processing fear, he's processing something else. Something that doesn't have a scream attached to it. That's the first hint that Morty's emotional range is bigger than just scared. There are things that happen to him that make him go silent instead of loud. That's going to matter. Rick Potion #9 is where things get genuinely dark for the first time. Morty asks Rick for a love potion for his crush, Jessica. It goes wrong in the most Rick and Morty way possible, cascading mutation events that eventually turn the entire human population on Earth into grotesque Morty-obsessed monsters, and then into praying mantis creatures, and then into what the show calls Cronenbergs. And then Rick just gives up on the planet. He finds a reality where they already solved it and then promptly died. He buries those versions of himself and Morty, and the two of them just move in. The scream in that episode isn't the loudest one in Season 1, but it might be the most important. Because when Morty sees his own dead body, when he sees himself decomposing in a garbage bag, being tossed into a backyard grave, the scream he lets out isn't fear, it's existential. It's something breaking. He wasn't supposed to see that. Nobody's supposed to see that. And what happens next is Morty sitting in front of a campfire, telling his sister Beth's friend about burying himself. Telling someone the real thing that happened. Not for laughs. Just because he needs to say it out loud to someone. Because he doesn't know how else to carry it. Season 1. Morty screams when he's scared. But he also cracks when the weight gets too heavy. And Rick Potion #9 is the first time the weight gets too heavy. It won't be the last. Chapter 2. The Anatomy of a Scream. Here's a thing that sounds obvious but is worth saying out loud. Not all screams are the same. That sounds basic. But once you start paying attention to it in the show, you realize how much work is actually being done by the type of scream, not just whether a scream happens. Justin Roiland, who voiced both Rick and Morty for the first 7 seasons, had a specific range for Morty's screams, and they genuinely communicate different things. The writers knew it, the animators knew it, you can feel the difference even if you've never consciously tried to analyze it. There's the panic scream. That's the most common one in Season 1. High, breathless, usually accompanied by flailing arms and some variation of Rick, Rick, Rick. It's the scream of someone who has zero context for what's happening and needs an adult immediately. The energy of it is almost childlike in a very specific way. It's the kind of scream where you're not trying to communicate anything, you're just making the loudest sound you can because your body has made the decision that screaming is the appropriate response to immediate physical danger. This scream usually gets a sarcastic response from Rick. Rick has heard it enough that he's basically stopped processing it as meaningful information. Then, there's the disgust scream. This is the one where Morty sees something viscerally wrong. Wrong body parts, wrong fluids, wrong configurations of matter, and his whole body recoils before his brain is involved. This scream has a different texture than the panic scream. It's shorter, sharper, and usually followed by physical movement away from whatever caused it. There's a specific episode in Season 1, Anatomy Park, where Morty gets shrunk and sent inside a man's body, and the disgust screams in that episode are almost rhythmic. Something gross, scream. Something grosser, bigger scream. Something that would genuinely traumatize a medical professional. Morty just goes completely silent for a second because his reaction system has overloaded. The silence after a disgust scream is actually funnier than the scream. Roiland understood that. Then there's what I'd call the helpless scream. This one's different from the panic scream because the panic scream happens when things are going wrong and might get worse. The helpless scream happens when Morty already knows things are bad and he can't do anything about it. It's lower in pitch, it's more sustained, it has a hopeless quality to it, like the scream itself isn't even expecting a response, it's just a sound his body makes because there's no other outlet. Rick Potion #9 has a great helpless scream when Morty watches his original home dimension just fall apart around them. When he understands that this isn't a problem Rick is going to solve. When he realizes that the life he had is just gone. That scream has no audience. He's not screaming at Rick. He's not screaming at Rick. He's not screaming at Rick. He's screaming because there's nothing else to do. And then there's the angry scream. We don't get this one much in Season 1. It shows up a little in the finale, in flashes, but it becomes much more common later. The angry scream is when Morty's fear has converted into something harder and louder. When the thing he's scared of becomes something he wants to push back against instead of just escape from. The transition from scared screams to angry screams is actually one of the most precise charts of Morty's development in the entire series. But there's one more type of scream worth naming. The fake scream. This one doesn't appear until later in the series, but it's the most devastating one when it does. The fake scream is when Morty does something scream-shaped. He makes the right sound, his face does the right thing, but it doesn't come from a real place. It's performance. It's a kid who's learned what the scared response is supposed to look like and is doing an impression of it. The fake scream is where you know something went really wrong. We'll come back to it. For now, just keep these categories in mind. Because when you watch Season 1, and most of what you're hearing is genuine panic screams and helpless screams, and then you watch Season 4 or 5 and you're hearing angry screams and occasional fake screams, and sometimes no scream at all, you'll understand exactly what that shift means. The voice changed because the person changed. And not in a good way. Chapter 3. The first scream that wasn't fear. Something Ricked This Way Comes is a Season 1 episode that people mostly remember for the Mr. Needful subplot. The devil who runs an antique shop where everything he sells has a curse attached to it, and Summer works for him. Rick versus the devil is genuinely funny and the episode is solid, but there's a moment in it that I don't think people talk about enough. And it doesn't actually involve a scream. It involves the absence of one. Morty and his actual grandfather on his dad's side go through a thing in this episode where they get bullied, and they stand up for themselves, and they beat the people up. And Morty's reaction during the fight is something worth examining. Because Morty doesn't scream during the fight. He grunts, he hits back, he engages. In Season 1, Episode 9. And then afterwards, there's a satisfaction on his face that isn't there in the aftermath of the scared screams. When Morty gets through a terrifying adventure and the scream is over, what's usually left is relief. Pure relief. He made it. Rick saved him, or he saved himself, or something random happened and the danger passed, and he breathes out. But after the fight, what's on his face is something different. He feels good. That's new. And it's worth sitting with, because what Something Ricked This Way Comes is quietly establishing is that Morty has a side that doesn't respond to threat with panic. He also has a side that responds to threat with aggression, and that side feels different in his body. It doesn't produce the breathless, cracking scream of, "Rick, Rick, help me." It produces something steadier and harder and, in some ways, scarier. Because the panicked, screaming Morty is a kid who wants someone else to make the bad things stop. The Morty who throws a punch without screaming is a kid who's starting to decide he might be the one who makes things stop. That shift doesn't fully land in Season 1. It's a hint. The episode mostly plays it for laughs. Roided up Rick and Morty walking down the street. Triumphant music, the camera lingering on their beefy makeovers. It's a gag. But the gag contains real information. Now, the first scream in the show that I would genuinely classify as not fear, not disgust, not helplessness, not panic, comes earlier than you might expect. It's in Me Seeks and Destroy, and it's the scream Morty lets out when he finds the courage to stand up to the giant. On its surface, it looks like a fear scream. He's terrified. His voice cracks. The whole thing, but the context is different. He's not running from something, he's running toward something. He came up with the plan. He's executing the plan. He's scared, yes, but the scream is coming from a place of action, not reaction. Fear screams are reactive. This scream is almost determined. It's tiny, it's early, it barely registers. But I think it's the first moment where Morty's scream contains something other than pure terror. There's something in there that wants to win, and you can't unhear it once you notice. Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind is a Season 1 episode that I want to spend some time on because it does something genuinely interesting with Morty's emotional range. The Evil Rick episode, where Rick is framed for killing other Ricks and they go on the run, and we learn about the Morty Farms. The Morty Farms. Okay, so the Council of Ricks has been kidnapping Mortys and using them as camouflage for evil Ricks, because the genius of a Rick is so loud that it disrupts the tracking systems, and a Morty's brain creates a kind of dead zone that hides the Rick signal. The implication being that Mortys are being used as shields, as equipment, their brains, their innocence, their anxiety, literally functioning as hiding places. Morty finds this out, and his reaction is not a scream, it's silence. A deep, quiet kind of silence that's more disturbing than any scream he's had up to that point. Because what he's processing isn't, "This is immediately dangerous to me." What he's processing is, "I have been a tool this whole time and I might have always known it." That silence is worth more than 100 panic screams in terms of what it tells you about where the character is going. And then after the silence, after the weight of that information has settled, Morty has a conversation with Rick about whether Rick actually cares about him. And Rick's response is the, "I like to imagine the end of the road" speech. Rick talks about how he always imagines a single road leading somewhere, and Morty is always ahead of him. And it's touching. It's one of the first genuinely touching moments in a show that was still figuring out how touching it wanted to be. But notice what Rick doesn't say. He doesn't say, "Yes, I care about you." He says, "I think about you a lot." He says, "There's always a Morty." And Morty smiles. Because at this point in the show, in Season 1, Morty still has enough hope and innocence to take the good faith reading of what Rick said. He hears, "I care about you," because he wants that to be true. Later versions of Morty would hear the ambiguity. But we're not there yet. Chapter 4, Season 2, and the scream that changed everything. Here's a thing that Season 2 does that Season 1 didn't do. It gets personal. Season 1 is scary and weird and dark, but the darkness is mostly external. Alien planets, monsters, scientific disasters. The threats are real, and they're big, and they're terrifying. But they're also kind of abstract. They don't come for Morty specifically. They come for whoever happens to be in the vicinity. Season 2 starts coming for Morty specifically. A Wrinkle in Time opens the season with the consequences of the Season 1 finale. Rick, Morty, and Summer have frozen time for 6 months while their parents went through their separation arc, and now time has been unfrozen and it's immediately unstable. The universe starts fracturing, and there's a moment where it looks like Morty is going to die, specifically where Morty sacrifices himself so Rick can survive, because Morty decides that Rick is more important than he is. Not more important than Morty's goals or desires. More important than his life. And the scream in that moment, when Morty thinks he's dying, when he's accepted it, is different from any Season 1 scream. It's not panicked. It's not helpless. It's resigned. There's something in Morty's voice in that moment that sounds like a kid who has decided he already knew it was going to end like this. Some part of him, at some point between Season 1 and Season 2, made peace with the idea that being around Rick might kill him. And when the moment comes, he doesn't fight it. He screams. But the scream doesn't ask for help. Rick saves him anyway. Rick gives up his own collar to keep the time crystal stable and saves Morty's life. And it's a huge moment for their relationship. Rick almost dies to save Morty. The machine that's supposed to fix it only has one dose. Rick chooses Morty. But here's the uncomfortable thing about that moment. Morty was ready to not be chosen. And nobody talks about that. Morty Night Run is a Season 2 episode that introduces a new dynamic to Morty's screaming. Rick has taken Morty to a space arcade while he does a weapons deal, and Morty discovers that one of the weapons Rick sold is going to be used to hunt down and kill a gaseous being named Fart. Morty decides to save Fart, and the adventure that follows is Morty making choices and dealing with consequences in a way that's different from Season 1. Because in Season 1, when things went wrong, Morty screamed and then adapted. In Morty Night Run, when things go wrong, Morty makes harder choices. Morty kills a guard. Not accidentally, not as a consequence of something else, but deliberately, because it's the only way through. And he screams after. That's the scream I want to talk about. The scream after the guard dies. That scream is the first true grief scream in the show. It's not fear, he's not in danger. The immediate problem is solved. But he screams because he just did something that can't be undone, and his body knows it before his brain has finished catching up. The scream is his nervous system trying to process a version of himself that he didn't have before that moment. Morty has killed before in Season 1, in Me Seeks and Destroy, in Rick Potion #9, but those were different. They happened in the fog of survival. In Morty Night Run, he makes the choice with full knowledge of what he's doing, and then Fart dies anyway. And Morty has to sit with the fact that he crossed a line that can't be uncrossed for something that still failed. The second scream in that episode, quieter, shorter, more internal, is almost worse than the first, because it's the sound of someone absorbing a lesson that nobody should have to learn that young. Sometimes you do the hard, irreversible thing and it still doesn't work. Season 2 also has autoerotic assimilation, and while that episode is mostly about Unity and Rick's complicated relationship history, it has a Morty thread worth noting. Morty and Summer exploring the Unity-controlled planet and getting increasingly disturbed by what a hive mind actually looks like up close. The screams in that episode aren't horror movie screams. They're "this is wrong" screams. They're moral disgust made audible. And that's a development, because moral disgust made audible requires a moral position. Early Season 1 Morty didn't have a strong enough sense of right and wrong to scream at the wrongness of something. He screamed at what scared him. By Season 2, he's developed enough of a moral framework that some things violate it, and his body reacts to those violations with something that sounds a lot like panic, but is actually closer to revulsion. Season 1 Morty screamed because he was scared. Season 2, Morty is starting to scream because he's upset. Those are different people. Total Recall is one of my favorite episodes in the series, for a lot of reasons, but the reason I'm bringing it up here is because of what Morty does at the end. If you remember, parasite aliens have infiltrated the Smith house and can implant false memories, creating fictional characters that feel like real family members. The way to kill them is to realize you only have positive memories of them. Real people have bad memories too. And at the end, Morty has to shoot Mr. Poopy Butthole, who might be real. And the way he does it, the scream he lets out before pulling the trigger, is something new. It's a decision scream. It's the scream of someone forcing themselves to do something their whole body is fighting against. The terror isn't of what might happen to him. The terror is of being wrong, of making the wrong call. Morty has started screaming about moral weight, not just physical danger. That is a massive development, and it happens quietly, in the middle of a B story, and most people miss it. Big Trouble in Little Sanchez is Season 2, Episode 7, and it gets way darker than its setup promises. Rick miniaturizes himself as a teenager, Tiny Rick, to infiltrate Morty's high school. And Tiny Rick is great. He's popular, he writes poetry, he slaps people on the back and calls them buddies. He seems fine. He is not fine. Because what's happening is that Tiny Rick, Rick's consciousness, compressed into a teenage body, is starting to lose the plot of who he is. He's starting to like being young and popular and not burdened by decades of existential awareness, and Morty and Summer recognize it before Rick does. Morty's screams in this episode are different from anything we've talked about so far, because he's screaming at Rick. Not because Rick is dragging him somewhere dangerous, not because Rick is about to get them both killed. Morty is screaming because he can see something happening to someone he loves, and he can't stop it, and it terrifies him in a completely new way. The dependency has inverted. In Season 1, Morty screamed for Rick because he needed Rick to save him. In this episode, Morty screams for Rick because Rick needs to be saved. And the scream sounds different. There's something almost parental about it, urgent and worried and helpless in a way that's protective rather than self-preserving. That inversion is huge, because it means Morty isn't just reacting to his own danger anymore. He's developed enough of a relationship, enough of a real one, that someone else's danger activates the same alarm system. He cares about Rick, not as a ticket to adventures, not as a safety net, but as a person he's afraid of losing. That's what the scream in Big Trouble in Little Sanchez is made of. And then the season ends with the wedding squanchers, and Rick turns himself in to the Galactic Federation to protect his family, and the whole world changes. And Morty's final response of Season 2 is not a scream at all. It's silence. Watching Rick get taken away. Not screaming, just watching. That silence is heavier than anything he could have said. Chapter 5, Season 3, and the Scream That Never Came. Season 3 opens with Rick escaping from prison. And it's one of the best cold opens in the show's history. Rick, in a memory of the moment he got his portal gun, rewriting the memory to figure out the Galactic Federation's password, then using that password to take over the Federation's currency system and cause its economy to collapse. Morty is barely in it. That's intentional. Season 3 opens by reminding you of who Rick is when Morty isn't there. Competent, ruthless, operating on a completely different level than everything around him. The Rick in the Season 3 premiere doesn't need a Morty to get things done. He needs a Morty the way a high-functioning person sometimes needs an anchor. Useful, necessary in specific ways, but not load-bearing in a fight. Morty shows up eventually, after the Smith family's status quo has been destroyed and rebuilt and destroyed again. And the Morty we see in Season 3 is different from Season 2. He's angrier. Not constantly. Not in a way that overrides everything else. But the anger is closer to the surface now. It's available in a way it wasn't before. Rick Mancing the Stone has a version of Morty who is actively seeking violence. Not for protection, not out of necessity. He finds an arm in the post-apocalyptic dimension that fuses to him and makes him powerful. And he doesn't want to let it go. He likes being strong. He likes being able to hit things. And the scream he lets out when he's fighting, it's not the scared scream, it's not the helpless scream, it's not even fully the angry scream. It's closer to release. Like screaming is the pressure valve for something that's been building up. And what's been building up is Season 2. What's been building up is Morty Night Run and the guard he killed and Fart dying anyway. What's been building up is Tiny Rick and watching Rick almost disappear. What's been building up is Rick Potion #9 and burying himself in a backyard. The screams in Rick Mancing the Stone have history in them. Vindicators 3, The Return of World Ender, is a Season 3 episode where Morty idolizes the Vindicators, a superhero team, and Rick sets up elaborate death traps for them while drunk. And there's a thing that happens emotionally for Morty in that episode that's worth unpacking. Morty is disillusioned. The Vindicators, whom he's admired and looked up to, turn out to be flawed and petty and selfish in ways that mirror Rick's worst qualities. And Rick, who Morty has been defending all season, set up a drunken death scenario that gets people killed. The scream Morty has in that episode is not a fear scream. It's a disillusionment scream, something between anger and grief and exhaustion. The scream of someone who is running out of heroes. Running out of people who are bigger and better and can be looked up to. Running out of the architecture of childhood that tells you who to trust and who to follow. Morty has been running that architecture off Rick for a long time. Season 3 is where it starts to crack. Morty's Mind Blowers is one of the most important episodes in the entire series for what we're talking about, and I want to spend real time on it. It's a clip show format, but not a real clip show. Rick has been storing Morty's worst memories in vials, wiping them from Morty's mind rather than letting Morty carry them. And when they accidentally break some of them, they watch together. The things in those vials are bad. Not adventure bad. Not scream because a monster is chasing you bad. The things in those vials are memories that broke something in Morty. Things that were too heavy to carry without falling apart, so Rick took them. And in a weird way, it's one of the kindest things Rick does in the entire series. He sees Morty breaking under the weight, and he removes the weight. He doesn't make a speech about it, he doesn't charge anything for it, he just takes the bad memories so Morty doesn't have to live with them. But here's what the episode doesn't fully say out loud. Some of those memories are bad because of Rick. Rick took memories that would have made Morty trust him less, think of him differently, understand something about how the dynamic between them actually works. Not all of them. Some of the memories are just genuinely traumatic things from adventures that Rick didn't cause. But some of them are things Rick did to Morty and then wiped so Morty wouldn't remember. The episode plays this ambiguously. It doesn't tell you what percentage of the mind blowers are Rick's fault, but the ambiguity is the point. You don't know. Morty doesn't know. And when Morty and Rick both wipe their own memories at the end and Summer has to reset them back to baseline, what's left unsaid is that this probably isn't the first time this has happened. Morty doesn't scream in Morty's mind blowers. He watches the vials. He reacts. He gets upset. He argues with Rick. But he doesn't scream. And the absence of the scream is significant. Because Season 1 Morty would have screamed. Season 1 Morty screams when he's scared and overwhelmed and doesn't know how to process what's happening. The Morty in Morty's Mind Blowers is overwhelmed by information that should be terrifying, and he just stays in his body. He doesn't leave himself, he sits with it. He's learned how to not scream. That's not necessarily progress. The Rick Chury and Morty date is the Season 3 finale, and it has a moment I keep coming back to. Morty and Rick have a falling out. Not a shouting match, not an adventure gone wrong, they just stop agreeing on what they're doing. They go their separate ways for a while. Morty goes back to his normal life. He tries to be a regular kid. He tries to be present in his family in a way that the adventures don't allow. And it doesn't fit. The regular life doesn't fit anymore. Morty has changed too much. He's seen too much. He's done too much. A house, a school, a family with regular problems, it's not wrong, it's not bad, but it doesn't fit the shape of what he's become. When Rick and Morty get back together at the end, there's no triumphant music. There's no scream of relief. There's just two people who don't really work without each other, which is a different thing from two people who choose to be together. The scream that isn't there is the scream of genuine joy. Morty should be relieved and happy. He found his way back to the relationship that shapes his entire life. But what he feels is more complicated than relief, and the show doesn't pretend otherwise. Chapter 6: What Fear Actually Costs. There's a misconception about trauma responses that I want to push back on for a second. People often assume that if you've been through a lot of scary things and you're not screaming anymore, that means you're tougher now, that you've built up resilience, that you've become the kind of person who doesn't panic under pressure. And sometimes that's true. But sometimes it means something went wrong with the alarm system. Morty's screams in Season 1 are annoying and constant and kind of exhausting. Rick finds them exhausting. We can see that. But they're also healthy in a very specific way. They're evidence of a functioning threat response system. Morty's body recognizes danger and makes noise about it. That's what it's supposed to do. There's a concept in psychology, don't worry, I'll keep this brief, about emotional numbing. When someone is exposed to repeated stressors or traumatic events, sometimes the brain short-circuits the emotional response to protect the person. Not because the person has become stronger, but because the brain has decided that fully feeling each threat is too expensive. So it starts charging less for each feeling, processing less, reacting smaller. From the outside, this looks like resilience. From the inside, it's more like distance. Like watching your life happen from slightly further away than where you used to stand. And I think this is a significant part of what's happening to Morty across the series. The screams don't go away because he's become capable. Some of them go away because he's become numb. And the show, which is genuinely smart about psychological damage in ways it rarely announces, tracks this really carefully. You can see it in the spacing of the quiet moments. Season 1. Morty goes from scream to scream with almost no buffer. He's living at maximum emotional volume. When something happens, he reacts to it immediately and fully. Season 3, Morty has buffer. He can let things happen and not react right away. He can absorb a pretty significant shock and hold it together. And sometimes that's because he's grown and learned and developed coping skills. But sometimes it's because the shock isn't registering at full volume anymore. The Ricklantis Mix-Up is a Season 3 episode that's mostly about Ricks and Mortys from different dimensions living together in the Citadel of Ricks. Morty, specifically a version of Morty called Simple Ricks, runs for president of the Citadel, and the episode charts his rise and fall and the corruption that comes with power. Our Morty is barely in it. But the Mortys in the Citadel are interesting precisely because they're all slightly different versions of the same base character at different stages of the same damage. Some of them have been domesticated. Some of them have been radicalized. Some of them have become Rick. And the Morty who wins the presidency of the Citadel ends the episode doing something terrible for understandable reasons. He kills the Rick candidate who betrayed him, and then looks out the window at the Citadel with an expression that's hard to read. It's not triumph, it's not guilt, it's not fear. It's something that's on the other side of all of those things. Something that happens when fear gets used up. Chapter 7. The Sound of Anger, Season 4. The show came back after a 2-year gap, and it came back differently. Something had settled in the writing. The show had figured out what it was and wasn't trying to do. And one of the things it definitely wasn't trying to do anymore was treat Morty's emotional responses as comedy beats. The screams in Season 4 are rare, and when they happen, they're almost always angry. Edge of Tomorty. Rick Die Rick Pete opens the season with Morty getting a death crystal, a crystal that shows you how you're going to die, and deciding to seek the future where he dies, with Jessica holding his hand. He becomes obsessed with this outcome. He starts making increasingly reckless decisions to protect this specific future. And Rick dies. Multiple times. Morty doesn't scream when Rick dies. He reacts, but the reaction is more tactical than emotional. He's concerned about the mission. He's concerned about the outcome he's protecting. He's managing the situation. That alone is kind of frightening if you've been following his emotional arc. But the scream that does happen in that episode, when Morty's plan is threatened, when it looks like Jessica is going to die and his preferred future disappears, that scream is pure rage. Not fear, not helplessness, rage. Morty has turned a corner where the primary threat response isn't, "I'm going to die" panic, but "someone is ruining something I want," fury. And those are very different emotional places to operate from. Fear is about survival. Anger is about control. And Morty, who spent Season 1 desperately trying to survive, has by Season 4 developed an investment in controlling outcomes. He has preferences now. He has things he wants. And when those things are threatened, the scream that comes out is protective anger, not survival panic. That's actually a real shift in how the character understands himself. He's not just trying to get through things anymore. He's trying to get something out of them. Pro-Mortius has a version of Morty who spends most of the episode with his face occupied by a parasite and doesn't react at all, which is a physical version of what we've been talking about emotionally. His face goes blank, his responses are muted, he operates on a reduced register for most of the episode's runtime, and when the parasite is removed and he comes back to full consciousness, the first real scream he lets out is relief, but it's muted relief. Not the gasping, full-body relief of Season 1 Morty who barely survives something. It's smaller, more contained, like the container got smaller. The Vat of Acid episode is Season 4 at its most precise about what it's doing with Morty's emotional state. Rick and Morty have been arguing about a vat of acid as a hiding spot. Morty thinks it's a bad plan, Rick thinks it's genius. Rick gives Morty a device that creates save points in reality, like a video game, and Morty goes wild with it. He lives multiple lives, he falls in love, he loses everything. He cycles through joy and grief dozens of times in the space of what feels like years. And then Rick reveals that the save point device was actually switching Morty to parallel realities each time he reset. And in every reset, the previous Morty died. All those people he cared about in those other lives, they experienced his death. The girl he fell in love with, she lost him multiple times. Morty screams in that episode. A long, sustained scream of pure horror that is completely different from almost everything we've heard from him before. It's not fear of physical danger. It's not anger at a blocked goal. It's the scream of realizing what you are capable of causing without knowing it. The scream of unintentional harm. And that scream, that specific kind of horror, doesn't exist in Season 1. Season 1. Morty doesn't have the self-awareness to scream at the damage he might cause. He screams at the damage being caused to him. By Season 4, he's developed enough moral understanding of his own position in the world to scream at his own impact on others. That's not a small change. Never Ricking Morty is an experimental episode where the show plays with narrative itself and the emotional content is harder to parse because the episode is intentionally meta. But there's a Morty in that episode who screams, not our Morty, but a story version of Morty, and the thing that interests me about that scream is what it's responding to. It's responding to Rick trying to control the narrative, which is, on some level, what Morty's whole arc is about. Rick writes the story. Rick decides what happens next. Rick puts Morty in positions, and Morty reacts to them. And for 3 seasons, Morty screams at the things in those positions. But starting in season 4, some screams are aimed at the positions themselves, at the framing, at the person deciding where Morty is going to be standing. That's a huge escalation, because screaming at the monster is survival. Screaming at the person who put you in front of the monster is something else entirely. Chapter 8. The Quiet Before the Storm. Before we get to what Season 5 does, and Season 5 does a lot, I want to stop and look at the quiet. Because somewhere in Season 3 and into Season 4, something starts disappearing from Morty's character. It's not the screaming. The screaming is still there, intermittently. What's disappearing is the recovery after the screaming. In Season 1, after a big scream moment, after something terrifying has happened, Morty recovers. He has a scene where he breathes out, where he processes, where he cries or laughs or sits in the back of the ship and just comes back to himself. The recovery scenes in Season 1 are almost as important as the scream scenes because they show you that the emotion went somewhere. It was processed. It moved through him. Rick Potion #9 has the campfire scene, which is Morty's recovery from one of the most traumatic things that happens to him in the whole series. He processes out loud, he tells someone, he finds a way to put the thing outside of himself. Me Seeks and Destroy has the quiet moment between Morty and Rick at the end, where Rick acknowledges, in a completely Rick way, that he knows something bad happened and he's there. These recovery scenes become rarer and rarer. By Season 4, there are episodes where something genuinely horrible happens to Morty and then the show just moves on. The credits roll. The next episode starts with a reset. Whatever Morty felt at the end of the last episode is either resolved off-screen or isn't mentioned. And you could argue that this is just TV. That's how episodic structure works. You can't resolve every emotional beat between episodes. But Rick and Morty has never been bound by episodic convention when it didn't want to be. Rick Potion #9 and the season that followed it prove that. The show remembers what it wants to remember. It resolves what it wants to resolve. So when Morty's recoveries stop happening on screen, I don't think it's because there's nothing to resolve. I think the show is showing you that the recovery isn't happening. The things are just accumulating, unprocessed. And the screams start sounding different when there's no recovery behind them. They start sounding like someone who knows this is going to happen again, who knows the moment of terror will pass and something else will take its place, and eventually that will pass too, and the whole thing will keep cycling. Someone who has learned that screaming doesn't really change what happens next. It just makes the moment louder. One Crew Over the Crew-Coo's Morty is a Season 4 heist episode with a lot of moving pieces, and I want to single out a specific Morty reaction that I think is underrated. In the middle of a fairly elaborate scheme, something goes genuinely wrong in a way that threatens real consequences, and Morty's reaction is nothing. Not nothing as in he didn't notice. Nothing as in he assessed, adapted, kept moving. No scream, no panic, no moment of visible fear. Just continuation. And that's where the numbness starts to look like competence, and it gets hard to tell them apart. Because Morty handling situations without panic can look like growth. It can look like he's developed skills and confidence and the ability to stay functional under pressure. And in some episodes, that's exactly what it is. But in other moments where the situation is bad enough that a fully feeling person should be scared, the absence of the scream starts to feel like something's missing. Not built, missing. That distinction matters for everything that's coming in Season 5. Chapter 9, Season 5, and the scream that changed everything. Again, Mort Dinner Rick Andre opens Season 5. Morty has been crushing on Jessica since the beginning of the show, the whole series. And in the Season 5 premiere, he finally gets a date with her. It's genuinely exciting in that specific Rick and Morty way. where you know it's not going to go well, but you're rooting for it anyway. And it goes badly. Not in a funny way, in a real, grinding, disappointing way. An old enemy of Rick's, a powerful man named Mr. Nimbus, who controls the oceans, whose relationship with Rick is complicated and vaguely homoerotic and hilarious, shows up and demands hospitality. And Rick keeps sending Morty on errands to another dimension where time moves much faster, meaning each trip ages the wine by centuries, but also meaning Morty is watching the people in that dimension live their entire lives. Multiple generations. People who Morty actually gets to know. People who build religions around him. People who eventually hate him, and the scream that Morty has when he realizes what the people in that dimension have become, when he realizes that his repeated appearances have been the catalyst for multiple generations of trauma and obsession and conflict. That scream is something we've never quite heard before. It's a scream of scale. It's the scream of someone who just understood that their impact on the world is much larger and more permanent and more complicated than they ever wanted it to be. Season 1 Morty screamed because bad things were happening to him. Season 5 Morty screams because he just realized he's been happening to other people this whole time. That inversion is complete. Mortyplicity is a Season 5 episode that's almost entirely decoy Smiths. Rick has created multiple decoy families to protect the real ones, and the episode follows the decoys realizing they exist and fighting each other. Our Morty is in it, but the episode is more about identity than emotional arc. What's interesting about Morty in Mortyplicity is not the screams, but what the episode is saying by making multiple Mortys. Because if you can have decoy Mortys who are functionally identical, who have all the same reactions and emotional responses and fears, what is the original Morty's selfhood exactly? What makes him real? The episode doesn't answer that, but it's asking. And Morty, by Season 5, is also asking. Not loudly, not in a scream, but you can see it in the way he operates. There's a kind of hesitation in him now that wasn't in Season 1. A moment before decisions where he seems to be checking in with himself. Is this what I actually want? Is this who I actually am? Or is this just the shape the adventure is pushing me into? Rick and Morty's Thanksploitation Spectacular has a fairly standard scream in the early going. Morty in genuine physical danger, reacting appropriately. But the scream is different in quality from the old ones. It's tighter, more controlled. He's not losing himself in the panic. He's panicking and tracking and planning at the same time. And that's actually impressive. But it's also concerning. Because nobody should be able to panic with one part of their brain while solving a problem with another part. That requires a split that most psychologists would look at and go, It's the emotional equivalent of being able to have a conversation while your leg is broken. Functional? In a crisis. But it means you've built walls inside yourself. A Mortican Grickfitty has a subplot where Morty and Summer take Rick's ship out while Rick is gone, and the ship, who hates Morty specifically, causes all kinds of problems. And Morty's reactions throughout that subplot are interesting because he's dealing with a problem that has no scream-worthy single moment. It's accumulated stress. It's a rolling low-level nightmare. And he handles it. Without screaming. Not because nothing is wrong. Not because he's confident it'll work out. But because the rolling low-level nightmare is, at this point, pretty much just Tuesday for Morty Smith. And he's learned to operate in Tuesday. Which is a sentence that should make you sad when you think about it long enough. Forgetting Sarek Mortshall is one of the most important episodes of Season 5 for what we're talking about. Rick decides to replace Morty, not as a grandson, but as an adventure partner. He finds two crows. He bonds with the two crows. He prefers the crows. And Morty's reaction to being replaced is not what Season 1 Morty would have done. Season 1 Morty would have been crushed, loudly. The scream would have come from a place of abandonment and confusion and genuine hurt. Season 5, Morty's reaction is something harder and quieter and more adult. He finds his own thing. He goes off with Nick, a guy who has a portal in his nipple, and has his own adventure. And in having his own adventure, away from Rick, he becomes someone slightly different than he is when Rick is present. There's a freedom in it that's quietly devastating, because it suggests that Rick's presence has been constraining something in Morty that wants to expand. And Morty doesn't scream when Rick chooses the crows. He just goes. That non-scream tells you something about how Morty's attachment to Rick has changed. The desperate need for Rick's approval that produced so many screams in early seasons, the need to be seen as capable, to be chosen, to matter to the most important person in his world, that need has shifted into something more resigned, more self-contained. He doesn't need Rick to choose him. He just needs to find somewhere else to be. The Season 5 finale, Rick Morty Jack, is a different kind of episode. It answers questions about Rick's backstory. It goes into the Citadel. It shows you a version of Morty who has spent a long time alone, waiting for Rick to come back, getting older. Evil Morty is fully revealed. And Evil Morty's exit, if you can call it a speech, it's more like a quiet verdict delivered by someone who has thought about this for a very long time, is the most important Scream-adjacent moment in the series, even though it's not a Scream at all. Evil Morty has been where regular Morty is going. He's lived further down the same road. He's seen what the Morty role actually costs, what it hollows out, what it consumes, and he's decided to leave. He doesn't scream his goodbye. He just goes. And regular Morty watches him leave, and doesn't scream. There's something being said in that silence that runs through the entire series if you look back at it from that moment. The Morty who started this story would have screamed. The Morty watching Evil Morty leave is past screaming about things like this. He just files it and moves on. Chapter 10. The Psychology Behind the Silence. Let's talk about what's actually happening to Morty's brain. Not in a clinical way, not in a here's a Wikipedia article about PTSD way, but in the way that you start to understand someone you've spent years watching, not by reading their file, but by watching the small choices they make, the way their shoulders sit, the things they don't say. Morty's relationship with fear is a learned thing. Not in the he learned to be brave sense. In the he learned that fear doesn't protect him sense. In Season 1, Morty's screams do something. They summon Rick. They communicate that a response is needed. They create a moment where the situation pauses and someone with more power steps in. The fear isn't just an emotional reaction, it's a functional tool. It gets things done. And then, slowly, it stops getting things done. Rick stops responding to the screams as much. Or he responds, but not in ways that change the outcome. Or the situations start coming faster, and the screams don't have time to summon anyone before the next thing starts. And Morty's nervous system starts learning. Screaming doesn't help. Handle it. That's the adjustment. And it's real, it's human, it's the thing that happens to people in difficult environments. The emotional response that used to be a tool gets retired because it's not useful anymore. And in its place, something more functional emerges. But here's the cost. The scream is not just a tool. It's also a signal. It signals to the world that something is wrong. It signals to the self that a line has been crossed, that this should not be happening, that this is not okay. The scream is the moment where the body stands up and says, "This is not normal. I am not okay with this." When Morty stops screaming, he stops drawing that line. Increasingly, by Season 5 and into Season 6, things happen to Morty that should produce a scream, that would have produced a scream in Season 1, and they don't. And the absence of the scream doesn't mean Morty is fine. It means Morty has stopped telling anyone, including himself, when he's not. There's a version of that which is maturity. There's another version of that which is something much sadder. And the show keeps both possibilities alive at once, which is one of the things that makes it genuinely good. Chapter 11. The Fake Scream. I mentioned this earlier, I've been building toward it. Let me explain what I mean by the fake scream in real terms. Solar X is the Season 6 premiere, and it's a big mythological episode. Portals are reset, people are sent to their original dimensions, it's about finding your way back. And there's a Morty reaction in that episode that I want to examine carefully. Morty is in a dangerous situation, a real one. The stakes are genuine, and he reacts. There's a scream, or something like a scream, but it has a quality to it that I can only describe as automatic. Like the emergency response system kicked in but wasn't really attached to anything. The scream had the shape of fear without the substance. And I want to be careful here because I'm describing something subtle. I'm not saying Morty wasn't scared. I'm not saying the scream was fake in the sense of being deliberately performed. I'm saying it sounded like a scream that came from the part of him that remembers what he's supposed to do in this situation, rather than from the part of him that's actually having this experience. You know how someone who's been through something many times can talk about it in a way that sounds like they're reciting it? The words are right, but the connection to the experience feels thin, like the telling has become separated from the feeling. That's what I'm calling the fake scream. The scream that doesn't cost anything anymore because the feeling it's supposed to express has been sealed off somewhere. And I want to be clear, this isn't the writers being lazy. This isn't the animation team not hitting the mark. It's intentional. The same show that gave Morty 3 full seasons of some of the most emotionally raw voice work in an animated series is not accidentally making him flatter. The flatness is the point. The scream that sounds like a memory of screaming is the show's way of telling you what has happened to Morty Smith. Rick, A Mort Well Lived, is season 6, and it has a version of Morty who is distributed across thousands of NPCs in a video game, each one carrying a fragment of his consciousness. It's a brilliant episode, and the Roy subplot hits hard in ways that are separate from Morty's arc. But what interests me is the moment when all those fragments come back together, when Morty reconstitutes, and is fine. Like, immediately fine, adjusted, back to baseline. A season 1 version of this happening would have been an episode-long recovery arc. What does it feel like to have your consciousness scattered and then reassembled? That's an enormous thing. That's the kind of thing that should produce a very long, very loud scream. Morty's response is basically, okay, I'm back, what's next? And season 6 Morty treats, my consciousness was temporarily scattered across thousands of fictional people the same way someone treats a Monday morning commute. Like it's just one of those things. And that should terrify you on his behalf. Chapter 12, Season 7, and the Silence That Speaks. Season 7 came with a significant change. Justin Roiland, who had voiced both Rick and Morty since the beginning, was no longer with the show. Ian Cardoni took over Rick. Harry Belden took over Morty. And here's what's interesting about that change from a scream analysis perspective. The new Morty sounds different. Not worse, not better, different. Harry Belden brought something to the role that's genuinely his own. But in the transition, some of the specific qualities of Roiland's Morty screams, the cracking quality, the breathlessness, the specific pitch of pure panic, those are no longer exactly available. And Season 7's writers knew this. What they did with it, consciously or not, is that Season 7 Morty screams less. Not dramatically less, not this is clearly a different character less, but the show moved slightly away from the full-body panic screams and slightly toward a Morty whose emotional expression lives in his face and his words more than his voice. And honestly, that fits the arc we've been tracing. The Morty in Season 7 has been through everything we've talked about. He's been through all of it. The screams of Season 1 are so far behind him that revisiting them would almost require the show to explain why Morty is less functional than he used to be. And the show isn't doing that. It's not saying Morty broke. It's saying Morty changed. How Poopy Got His Poop Back is a Season 7 episode that involves Mr. Poopy Butthole, who has gone through his own arc in the years between his introduction and now. And the emotional thread between Poopy Butthole and the Smiths is one of the more underrated relationships in the show. And there's a Morty moment in that episode that's almost breathtaking in its quietness. Something happens that should provoke a reaction, and Morty processes it, visibly. You can watch it happening in his face, but there's no scream, no externalized panic. He has the feeling, and then he integrates it, and then he responds to it in a way that's appropriate and measured. And you realize that's what healthy emotional processing looks like. Except, there's something missing from it that's hard to articulate. The feeling, before it was integrated, was real and big. You could see the bigness of it in the moment before the integration. And then it got integrated very quickly, very efficiently, maybe too efficiently. The speed of integration is where the concern lives. Wet Kuat Amortican Summer has Morty and Summer as the primary duo, and the episode is genuinely fun, a summer camp setting with escalating absurdity. And what the episode gives us is a version of Morty who is comfortable being capable. Not comfortable in the way that comes from confidence. Comfortable in the way that comes from resignation. Like, yes, things are going to go wrong. Yes, I will have to handle them. Let's just get to that part so we can get through it. There's no scream when the absurdity starts. Morty is just ready. Ready for disaster is a strange thing to be at his age. Rise of the Numbericons and its continuation have the show at its most cosmic in terms of scale. Reality itself being threatened, enormous numbers of lives at stake, existential scenarios that should be the most overwhelming things Morty has ever encountered. And Morty handles it, without much screaming. And by this point in the series, the absence of the scream has accumulated enough weight that it registers differently than it did in Season 4. In Season 4, no scream in a scary moment could mean Morty has grown. In Season 7, no scream in a moment that would have been a screaming spiral in Season 1 means something heavier. It means we're near the end of the story. Not the show. The show is still going. But the story of the scream. That story is almost over. Chapter 13. Evil Morty and the Scream That Explained Everything. Evil Morty is the scream. Let me explain that. Evil Morty appears first in Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, Season 1, Episode 10. He appears to be a puppet, a Morty being controlled by the Eye Patch Morty who's secretly the mastermind. And then the reveal hits. Eye Patch Morty is the mastermind. There is no Rick controlling him. He controlled the Rick. And then he disappears. We don't see him again until much later. But he's there in the background of the series in a way that's easy to miss. A question mark at the edge of the frame. A Morty who took the Morty experience and made a different decision about it. In the Rick Lantis mix-up, he runs for president of the Citadel. In Rick Morty Jack, we finally understand something about who he is. Evil Morty looked at the dynamic between Ricks and Mortys, the one where Mortys are shields and tools and emotional camouflage for genius. The one where being a Morty means providing a function rather than being a person. And he decided, no. He found the door out. And here's the thing about Evil Morty's arc that I think is underrated as a mirror for the main Morty. Evil Morty screamed early too. Back when he was a regular Morty, presumably. Back before he became the thing he is now. He had the same scream, the same panic, the same terror. He was the same kid. And then he processed it differently. The main Morty's response to repeated trauma is adaptation, gradual numbing, forward motion without fully reckoning with what's been lost. Evil Morty's response was different. He got angry. He stayed angry. He didn't adapt to the system. He took the anger and the intelligence that was always underneath the screams, and he pointed it at something. He decided the screaming was a symptom of a system that shouldn't exist, and he burned the system down. Now, Evil Morty is the villain. Let's be clear about that. The things he does to accomplish his goals are not good. The Ricks he kills, the methods he uses, the lack of regard for anything other than the outcome he wants, those are bad. But the origin of his drive isn't evil. It's Morty screams turned into Morty purpose. And what makes that interesting in the context of the regular Morty's arc is that it shows us the road not taken. Regular Morty absorbs the damage and keeps going. Evil Morty felt the damage and refused to keep going in a direction that produced it. One of them is still screaming, in a way. Just not audibly. Chapter 14, The Last Real Scream. If I had to point to the last moment in Rick and Morty where Morty screams in a way that costs him something, a scream that is fully connected to something real that he is fully feeling, I think it's in Season 5. Rick and Morty Jack. Morty finds out about Rick's full backstory. About the Rick whose wife and daughter were killed by another Rick. About the path that turned him into the Rick we know. And the way Morty processes this information, the way it changes how he looks at Rick, involves a reaction that's close to what I've been calling the scream. But it's more like a cry. He cries in a way that doesn't look performed, that doesn't look like the automatic response to danger. That looks like someone who finally understands something he's been carrying without knowing it, and the understanding hits hard enough to reach the part of him that can still be reached. The fact that it's grief, rather than fear, tells you where Morty is. Season 1, Morty screamed because he was scared. Season 5, Morty cries because he's heartbroken. Those are the same person at different points on the same line. And the cry in Rick and Morty Jack might be the most honest Morty moment in the series. Not because it's the most dramatic or the most consequential, but because it's the most fully felt. After seasons of the scream becoming rarer and less connected to something real, here's a Morty who is fully in a moment of genuine emotional pain. He's not managing it, he's not filing it, he's not moving through it efficiently, he's just having it. And it's beautiful and devastating in the same breath. After that, the cries and screams get even rarer, and the ones that do happen have less of that quality. The fully present, fully feeling Morty moment in Rick Morty Jack starts to feel, in retrospect, like a goodbye. Like one last clear note from someone who is slowly learning a different kind of song. Chapter 15, What Happened to the Kid Who Couldn't Stop Screaming? Here's the thing about Morty Smith's screams. The show never made them a big deal. It never stopped to announce that Morty screamed less now. It never had a moment where a character said, "You know, you used to be terrified of everything." Nobody has a scene where they observe the change out loud. It just happened. In the background, in the margins, in the space between adventures where the emotional stuff lives. And I think that's actually the most precise thing the show does with this arc, whether it's entirely intentional or not. Because real damage to people doesn't usually announce itself either. The kid who was jumping at everything at 15 isn't jumping anymore at 25, and nobody throws a party to mark the transition. The moments where the scream would have happened in the past and doesn't happen now don't ring a bell or fire an alarm. Time just moves, and the person moves with it, and what they leave behind accumulates invisibly, until one day, someone who knew them at the beginning looks at them now and sees less. Not less in a bad way necessarily, but less. Less surface area. Less exposed. Less reachable. Morty at the start of the series is incredibly reachable. You can see everything happening to him in real time. Every fear, every confusion, every moment of small joy and enormous dread. He's transparent in the way that children often are, the face giving away everything that the mind is processing. And he's genuinely lovable in that transparency. The early screams are funny, but they're also endearing. They're the screams of someone who hasn't learned to hide yet. Someone who doesn't know how to perform composure because composure hasn't been necessary. Someone who screams because the scream is real and hasn't been trained out of him. Somewhere across 7 seasons, the training happened, and now the scream is mostly gone. And Morty is fine. He's capable, and he's smart, and he survives things that would end most people, and he keeps going with a kind of steady forward motion that looks like growth. But I find myself missing the kid who couldn't stop screaming. Not because the screaming was good, or because being that scared was good, but because the screaming meant that every moment of danger still reached him, still landed, still registered as something that mattered. The scream was evidence that Morty cared about his own survival in a way that was fresh and immediate and undiminished. The quiet Morty survives. But something about the way he does it suggests he stopped thinking of survival as the most important thing. And I don't know what to do with that. Chapter 16, The Thing About Rick. I've spent a lot of time talking about Morty, but I haven't fully said the obvious thing. Rick did this. Not intentionally, not maliciously, not in a Rick is evil way, because Rick isn't evil, but the environment Rick created, the constant danger, the relentless exposure, the removal of recovery time, the pace of adventure that doesn't account for processing, the mind-blowers that took away the memories before Morty could even start to integrate them, that environment produced the silence. Rick is the reason Morty screams so much in Season 1. And Rick is, in a quieter and more complicated way, the reason Morty stopped screaming. Because the screams were always a response to something Rick put him in front of. And over time, the screams taught Morty's brain that the screaming doesn't change what Rick is going to do next, doesn't change where Rick is going to take him, doesn't change the nature of the world Rick has introduced him to. So the screams became less and less useful, and less frequent. And Rick, who has always claimed that Morty is his co-adventurer and his partner, is also the person whose patterns produced a kid who learned to stop reacting. There's a version of this where that's growth. There's a version of this where that's Rick's greatest unintentional harm. And the show holds both of those in the frame at once without blinking. Which is why it's good. The smartest episode in the series, and I'll stand on that hill, might be Morty's Mind Blowers, precisely because it refuses to tell you which one Rick is being. It holds the kindness and the damage in the exact same gesture. Taking the memories is protection and erasure at the same time. And the show doesn't resolve that. It lets it sit there being both things. Because in real relationships between real people, love does both things sometimes. Care and harm in the same movement. Morty never stops caring about Rick. And Rick, in his absolutely Rick way, never stops caring about Morty. But that caring has costs, and the costs accumulated, and the accounting of those costs is written in the progression from Season 1 Screams to Season 7 Silence. Rick would not like to read that accounting, but the show wrote it for him anyway. Chapter 17, The Distillation. I've watched a lot of character analyses of Rick and Morty. A lot of them focus on Rick, which makes sense. Rick is the dazzling one, the one who gives speeches and makes the big moves and is written with the most obvious intelligence. But Morty's arc, when you look at it through the Screams, is actually more complete. Rick starts the series as someone who has already survived his damage and built himself around it. His character arc is about slowly dismantling the defenses, letting people in, admitting that he needs things. Morty starts the series as someone who hasn't been damaged yet, and we get to watch him become damaged, slowly, in real time. And the Screams are the most precise measurement of how that's going. Each Scream in Season 1 is a kid at full emotional capacity, full range, full volume, every feeling finding its expression immediately and completely. Each reduced Scream in later seasons is evidence of that capacity being compressed, not destroyed, not gone, just smaller, less immediate, more managed. And management is a reasonable response to an unreasonable amount of experience. Nobody should expect Morty to scream in Season 6 the way he screamed in Season 1. He's been through too much. His nervous system has adapted. He functions. But if you line up the scream from the pilot next to the silence from the Season 6 premiere, and you just listen to the difference, there is a loss in that silence. A specific, measured, trackable loss. The boy who couldn't stop screaming became someone who rarely screams anymore. And the journey between those two things is the whole show, really. Not the space travel. Not Rick's genius. Not the Council of Ricks or the Citadel or the Federation or any of the big lore pieces. The journey from screaming to silence. That's what Rick and Morty has been telling this whole time. Chapter 18, The Ending. Here's where I land. Morty Smith is a genuinely interesting character study in what happens when someone is exposed to too much too fast. He started out terrified, full of scream, full of reaction. A kid who wore everything on the outside because he hadn't yet learned that the outside was exposed. He became someone who handles things, who adapts, who doesn't lose it when losing it would be reasonable. And that transformation happened because of love, and because of damage, and because of time, and because of Rick Sanchez, and because of the way that enough adventures start to create not strength but pattern recognition. You stop screaming not when the world becomes safe. You stop screaming when you've run out of the belief that screaming does anything. The biggest change in Morty across the series wasn't that he got smarter. He did get smarter. He absolutely got smarter and more capable and more able to handle himself in situations that would end most people. But the biggest change is that he became quiet. And the quiet isn't peace. It's just what's left when the scream runs out. Somewhere in the distance between the pilot episode and where the show is now, a teenager used to scream his head off in alien marketplaces and spacecraft and nightmare dimensions and backyard graves. He screamed because he was scared, and because he was alive, and because everything was new and real and impossible to absorb without making noise about it. And he was annoying about it. Rick was right about that. But he was also completely undeniably present, every single moment, at full volume. The silence that replaced him is impressive and sad in equal measure. And the saddest part is that neither of them, not Morty, not Rick, is going to stand up one day and say, something is different now. Something is quieter now. Something is gone. They're just going to keep going. Because that's what you do when the scream runs out. You keep going. And the boy who used to scream? He keeps going too. Just quieter now. Just quieter. Chapter 19. The Weight of Small Moments. There's something I haven't talked about yet that I think is actually the most underrated part of this whole thing. It's not the big screams. It's the small ones that disappeared first. In Season 1, Morty makes little sounds constantly, little yelps when something surprises him, short, sharp inhales when Rick does something unexpected, small vocalizations of discomfort when they land somewhere weird, or the portal closes too fast, or the alien hands him something and he doesn't know what it is. These micro-reactions are everywhere in the early seasons, and they're almost invisible because the big screams get all the attention. But watch Season 1 without looking for the big dramatic moments. Just watch Morty as a background presence. Watch him reacting to the texture of being in this world. He's constantly expressive, constantly making small sounds and facial movements and little adjustments in his body that communicate something. The world keeps landing on him, and he keeps making tiny responses to each landing. He's in contact with his experience in a way that's just constant, uninterrupted. By Season 6, those micro-reactions are mostly gone. Morty can walk into an alien marketplace, a place that would have produced 45 small sounds from Season 1 Morty, and just walk through it. Eyes forward, processing, yes. Noticing, maybe, but not showing it. Not performing the noticing, not letting the noticing reach his face. That's learned. That's not who he was at the start. That's a layer of insulation that built up over time, one adventure at a time, until the outside world stopped leaving fingerprints on him the way it used to. And I know that sounds like I'm romanticizing being a nervous, overwhelmed, screaming mess. I'm not. I'm just saying, the expressiveness of Season 1 Morty is evidence of a kid who is genuinely in his life, genuinely affected by what's happening around him, genuinely present. And when that expressiveness compresses, when the small sounds stop, when the micro-reactions smooth out into a more functional baseline, something was traded for that. The thing that was traded was contact. Morty made himself slightly less permeable to experience. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Chapter 20, The Jessica Problem. I want to spend a minute on Jessica. Not because Jessica is a major character, she's not really, not until Season 5 gives her more to do, but because Morty's feelings about Jessica are one of the few consistent through lines in his emotional life across the whole series. He has a crush on her from the first episode. He has feelings for her in Season 5. That's a long time to carry something. And the way those feelings are expressed changes in exactly the way you'd expect if you've been following the Scream arc. Season 1 Morty, when he's around Jessica, becomes almost dangerously expressive. He can't manage it. His face does things. He says things he immediately regrets. He's completely legible to anyone watching him. The feelings are right there at the surface, visible from space. Season 3. Morty has learned to be cooler about it. He still cares, but he can maintain something closer to composure when she's around. He can have a conversation without his nervous system broadcasting the whole thing. Season 5 Morty, in Mort Dinner Rick Andre, has the most interesting relationship with Jessica in the series, because for the first time, he actually has the opportunity to go on a date with her. And the version of Morty who goes on that date is not Season 1 Morty. He's not the kid who would have lost his mind at the idea of sitting across from her at a restaurant. He's a version of Morty who handles the date the way he handles most things now, with a kind of resigned competence that has less joy in it than you'd expect. Things go wrong. Immediately. Of course they do. And Morty's response to things going wrong on his first date with the girl he's liked for years is not the screaming, spiraling, helpless panic of Season 1. It's problem solving. He mode switches to crisis management before the date has even gotten started. And that's impressive, in the same way that all of Morty's Season 5 competence is impressive. But it's also a little heartbreaking. Because somewhere in the journey from Season 1 to Season 5, Morty lost the specific kind of vulnerability that would have made the date feel like a date. The version of himself that would have been genuinely, openly terrified of saying the wrong thing. The version that would have screamed, internally if not externally, at how much it meant to him. That version of Morty would have made a lot of mistakes on that date. But he would have been there. Fully there. The Season 5 Morty is there in a more limited way, managing, coping, problem-solving his way through the thing he was supposed to be feeling. Which is, as a portrait of what accumulated experience does to a person's capacity for straightforward emotion, pretty devastating. Chapter 21, The Supporting Evidence. I want to spend some time on the characters around Morty, because you can also track what's happening to Morty by watching how other characters react to him. In Season 1, Rick reacts to Morty's screams, sometimes dismissively, sometimes sarcastically, but he reacts. He acknowledges them. He treats them as information. Morty is scared. This means I need to either rescue Morty or tell Morty to calm down. The screams have communicative function. By season 5 and 6, Rick has stopped reacting to Morty's screams because there aren't enough of them to react to. But more importantly, and this is the thing I want you to notice, Rick has also stopped preemptively managing Morty's emotional state. In season 1, Rick occasionally does things to try to prevent a Morty scream. He gives brief, practical explanations. He creates small buffers between Morty and the worst of what they're encountering. He manages the exposure a little. Not much, not consistently, but sometimes. By later seasons, he's stopped. Not because he's crueler, because he doesn't need to anymore. Morty doesn't need that management anymore. And Rick, who is perceptive in ways he doesn't always demonstrate, probably knows that. Probably understands that Morty has changed enough to not need those small buffers. But understanding it and knowing whether it's good are different things. Summer is worth mentioning too, because Summer's relationship with Morty shifts in really interesting ways. In early seasons, Summer is the skeptic, the one who doesn't believe in what Rick and Morty are doing, who thinks the adventures are dangerous and ridiculous and not worth the cost. By middle seasons, Summer is a participant, and she adapts faster than Morty does, in some ways. She doesn't have the same scream history. She joined the adventures later, and with more context, more ability to choose. But here's what's interesting. Summer notices what happens to Morty in a way that other characters don't always acknowledge. There are moments, in Rickmancing the Stone, in Big Trouble in Little Sanchez, in quiet moments throughout season 3 and 4, where Summer looks at Morty with an expression that isn't quite concerned but isn't casual either. Something that recognizes her brother is different than he was. She doesn't say it. Nobody says it, but she sees it. And the fact that she sees it, and says nothing, is its own kind of quiet tragedy. Chapter 22, The Music Thing. There's something that happens in Rick and Morty, particularly in the earlier seasons, with the music during Morty's most intense moments. The show uses licensed music really specifically, and one of the things it does is sometimes play music over Morty's screams in a way that makes the scream feel different depending on what's underneath it. In Rick Potion #9, when Morty watches his original life fall apart and buries himself, the music that plays isn't comedic, it's genuinely sad. The combination of the music and Morty's shell-shocked face and the silence of that campfire scene creates something that the scream alone couldn't have created. The show uses music to tell you what category of moment you're in. Comedic screams get comedic music or no music. Genuine emotional beats get something underneath that cues you to feel it differently. And what I noticed, going through the series, is that the music-backed Morty moments become rarer over time in the same pattern as the screams. Not because the show stops using music, it doesn't, but because the moments where Morty's emotional state is the primary thing happening in the scene become less common. More often, Morty is the competent second in a scene where Rick is driving the emotional content. More often, Morty's feelings are in the background. More often, the music is scoring something other than Morty's interior life. And that's not a coincidence. The show knows what it's doing. It's showing you, through the music as much as through the screams, that Morty's emotional experience has moved away from center stage. Not because he matters less, but because he's learned to take up less space. Chapter 23, What the Screams Were Actually About. I want to step back and say something that I've been building toward, but haven't said directly. Morty's screams, in season 1, are about more than fear. They're about the shock of existence. What I mean is this. Morty, at 14, has just discovered that the universe is incomprehensibly large and dangerous and strange. He hasn't built the mental architecture yet that most people build as they get older, the architecture that lets you process the largeness of reality without falling apart. He doesn't have the emotional calluses yet. He doesn't have the learned patterns of normalization. Every new thing is genuinely new, and that newness is terrifying. But it's also, and this is the part that gets lost when we only talk about the fear, it's also wonderful. There are moments in early Morty where the scream transitions into something else, where the terror of the new thing gets mixed up with the awe of it, where the scream has joy in it alongside the panic. The slide in Anatomy Park where Morty rides through the inside of a human body is terrifying and it produces screaming. But there's also wonder in that scream. The animation shows it. The voice performance had it. Season 1 Morty is someone who is experiencing wonder and terror as the same thing, because both of them come from the same source. The world is bigger than he knew. By Season 6, the world being bigger than he knew is just a fact he's already integrated. And the screams that came from the wonder and terror of discovering that fact, those screams don't have anywhere to come from anymore. You can't rediscover the largeness of the universe. Once you know, you know. And when you know, the world stops taking your breath away. It just becomes the world you live in. Which is true of everyone to some extent as they get older. It's just that most people's process of normalizing the world happens over decades. Morty's happened in about 4 or 5 years of adventure. He got old faster than anyone should. Chapter 24. The Pilot versus the Present. Let me do something direct here. Let me just compare. Season 1, Episode 1. Rick and Morty arrive on an alien planet to pick up seeds. Rick has been there before. He knows the terrain, the risks, the approximate shape of what's going to happen. Morty has no idea. He follows Rick through a place that is completely alien and completely threatening and completely real to him in a way that nothing in his previous life prepared him for. Morty screams, multiple times, with full-body commitment. Each scream is different from the last. Different pitch, different cause, different quality. Each scream is a fresh response to a fresh thing. He is overwhelmed. He is present. He is completely and totally in over his head. Now. Season 7. Any episode, any moment where Morty faces something that would have produced that Season 1 scream. He responds, competently, maybe with a short vocalization of surprise, maybe with a quick expression that acknowledges the danger, maybe with an immediate pivot to problem solving. He handles it. He is not overwhelmed. He is not fully in over his head. He may be in danger. He may even be scared, on some level. But the fear doesn't overflow. The experience doesn't exceed his capacity to manage it. And the question that hangs over that comparison, the question the show never quite asks out loud, but never quite lets go of either, is that better? Is the Season 7 Morty better off than the Season 1 Morty? He's safer, maybe. More capable, certainly. Less likely to get himself killed by panicking at the wrong moment. But the Season 1 Morty was alive in a way that Season 7 Morty isn't quite. Terrified, overwhelmed, screaming, but alive. And that's the whole thing, really. That's everything this video has been building toward. The question isn't whether Morty has grown. He has. The question is what the growing cost. And the answer is written in every scream that didn't happen. Chapter 25. The Ones Who Didn't Make It. Rick and Morty has a lot of Mortys. Not just evil Morty. There's the whole Citadel, full of them. There are Mortys from destroyed dimensions, Mortys who died on adventures, Mortys who are still alive in dimensions where the show never goes. And if you think about the emotional arc we've been tracing, the screams becoming rarer and quieter and more managed, you have to wonder how many other Mortys went through this same journey. How many of them made it to Season 7 levels of quiet competence? How many of them broke somewhere along the way? The Morty farm suggests the answer isn't reassuring. The Mortys in the Citadel, the ones who have been living there for years, adapting to a world where Mortys are second-class citizens by definition, have all kinds of emotional states. Some of them are angry, some of them are resigned, some of them have built something like dignity in an environment that was designed not to allow it. But what's interesting about the Citadel Mortys is that many of them scream more than our Morty does. The Mortys who haven't been on adventures, who haven't built up the experience base that our Morty has, react with more immediate emotion, more visible feeling, more scream. Our Morty is, in the context of the Citadel, unusually contained, unusually quiet. And the other Mortys can tell. There's something about how the Citadel Mortys look at our Morty in the Rick Lantis mix-up and Rick Mirai Jack that suggests they recognize something in him. Not envy exactly. Not admiration exactly. Something more complicated than either. Like they can see the distance in him and they're not sure if they want what he has. Chapter 26. The Scene the Show Never Wrote. I want to tell you about a scene that doesn't exist. A scene the show never wrote. I've thought about this a lot. If you were going to write the scene that captures everything this video has been about, the full arc from first scream to last silence, what would it look like? I think it would be simple. Rick and Morty, somewhere, not on an adventure, maybe in the garage, maybe in the ship, just the two of them. And something small happens. Not dangerous, not cosmic, just something mildly unpleasant. The kind of thing that would have produced a little Morty yelp in season 1. A minor discomfort, a small surprise. And Morty doesn't react. Or he barely reacts. A slight tightening around the eyes, a small adjustment of posture. And Rick notices. Not the reaction, the lack of reaction. And for just a second, something crosses Rick's face that isn't his usual expression. Something that might be concern, might be recognition, might be something closer to guilt. But he doesn't say anything. Because what would he say? I noticed you don't scream anymore. I remember when that would have scared you. I think I might have done something to you without meaning to. Rick Sanchez is not a character who says those things. So he doesn't say them. And Morty doesn't notice the look. Or, if he does, he files it. And they move on to whatever comes next. The show never wrote that scene. But it's there anyway. In every quiet moment that should have been loud. In every adventure that Morty handled when the old Morty would have fallen apart. It's there. The show wrote it without writing it. And if you've been watching carefully enough, you already know what it says. Chapter 27. The final thing. I started this video with a simple observation. Morty used to scream constantly, and now he barely screams at all. And I said that meant something. That the progression from screaming to silence was a story. I've spent a long time now trying to tell that story. Going through the seasons, the specific moments, the types of screams and the types of silences, the psychology of what happens when someone is exposed to too much too fast and their nervous system adapts. But I want to end on something that isn't just analysis. Because analysis is the wrong tool for the last part. The last part just needs to be said. Morty Smith was a terrified, screaming, overwhelmed 14-year-old kid who followed his grandfather into the impossible and never really found his way back. Not back to the house on the cul-de-sac. Back to the version of himself that existed before the first portal. That version of him, the one who would lose his mind at alien creatures, who would scream for Rick at the first sign of danger, who would crack under existential weight and need to sit by a campfire and say the scary thing out loud to someone. That version of him did something that the quieter, more capable, more managed version of him can't do anymore. He felt everything. Right away. Without a filter. Without the layer of experience that taught him how to absorb impact without showing it. He was uncomfortable and alive, and scared and present, and he made noise about all of it because the noise was real and the feeling was real, and there was nothing between him and the thing that was happening to him. The silence that came after is a kind of armor. Good armor. Useful armor. Armor that probably saved his life a dozen times in later seasons. But armor is always also distance. And the kid who used to scream from the full depth of his fear, the distance swallowed him up. We watched it happen, season by season, scream by scream, until the screams stopped. And what was left was someone who could handle anything, and felt almost nothing. Extended analysis, the scream as social contract. Here's something that doesn't get discussed in most Rick and Morty analysis. The scream isn't just Morty expressing himself. It's Morty communicating with Rick. And the nature of that communication changes across the series in ways that mirror the power dynamic between them. In Season 1, Morty's scream does something real. It tells Rick where Morty is. It tells Rick what's wrong. It tells Rick how bad it is. And Rick responds, sometimes helpfully, sometimes sarcastically, sometimes just with more information that Morty needs to not die. But he responds. There's a feedback loop. Morty screams. Rick receives, Rick adjusts, the adventure continues. And that feedback loop matters because it means Morty's emotional state is part of how the adventure gets navigated. Morty's fear is information that Rick is incorporating into his decisions. Consciously or not, Rick is tracking Morty's emotional state and using it as data. Now watch what happens as the seasons go on. Morty screams less. Rick adjusts less to Morty's emotional state. Either because Morty is screening better, not letting the scream out until it's truly necessary, or because Morty has learned that the scream doesn't produce the response it used to. The feedback loop tightens, and then it compresses. By season 4 and 5, Morty mostly doesn't communicate his fear to Rick in real time. He manages it internally, processes it on the fly, deals with it without broadcasting. And Rick, who was always the dominant force in the relationship, has less information about Morty's state as a result. Which means the adventures get planned and executed with less accounting for Morty's limits. Which means Morty gets pushed harder. Which means there's more to suppress. Which means the scream gets buried deeper. It's a reinforcing cycle, and it's one that Rick, who built most of the conditions for it, probably doesn't fully see. Because from Rick's perspective, Morty just got better. More capable, more functional, less likely to cause problems with the mission. But the problems with the mission that Morty's screams used to cause were actually Morty being honest about what he could handle. And now that honesty is gone, the mission runs smoother. But something was lost in the smoothing. Extended analysis, 3 screams that define the arc. If I had to pick 3 screams, just 3, that capture the full emotional journey of Morty Smith across the series, here's what I'd choose. The first scream. Pilot episode. Morty screaming on the alien planet. It's the scream of pure, undiluted exposure. A kid who has never been anywhere like this, never done anything like this, and has no resources at all for processing it. The scream is the whole of his response. He doesn't have any tools yet. All he can do is make the loudest sound his body is capable of. It's a scream that exists entirely in the present moment. It's not about anything except what's happening right now. No history of screams behind it. No learned patterns of response. Just, this is happening and it is too much. That's where we start. The Vat of Acid scream. Season 4. The scream when Morty understands what he did to the girl. What the save points actually were. The people he thought he left behind who actually experienced his death. This scream comes from a completely different place than the pilot scream. It's not about immediate physical danger. It's not even really about fear. It's the scream of moral horror, of self-understanding, of a kid who just realized he's the kind of person bad things happen around, and that his presence in people's lives has weight and consequence that he never accounted for. The pilot scream is about the world being too big. The Vat of Acid scream is about Morty being too big. Too present. Too consequential, too capable of causing harm. That's the middle, the Rick Morty Jack cry. Not a scream exactly, more of a breakdown. Season 5 finale, Morty processing Rick's full backstory. This one is quieter than the other two, more internal, more specifically his. The pilot scream is about everything being overwhelming. The Vat of Acid scream is about understanding impact. The Rick Morty Jack cry is about grief, about caring, about having enough history with someone that their pain becomes your pain in a way that's almost involuntary. It's the scream that comes from the deepest place. And it's the last one that really costs him something. After that, the screams mostly stop costing. After that, the armor holds. Extended analysis. What animation does that live action can't? One of the underappreciated things about Rick and Morty as an animated show is what animation allows the writers to do with Morty's physical responses. Live action has limits. An actor can scream, can look scared, can run. But there are physical and logistical limits to how extreme the fear responses can get before they start looking silly rather than genuine. Animation doesn't have those limits. Morty's eyes can go wide in a way that no human eyes go. His jaw can drop further than physically possible. His entire body can vibrate with terror. His face can do multiple things at once in a way that real faces can't quite do. And in Season 1, the show uses this constantly. Morty is animated at maximum emotional expression. When he's scared, everything in his design is scared. When he's confused, his entire shape communicates confusion. When he screams, the scream is drawn as much as it's voiced. It's pure, unfiltered cartoon exaggeration, but in service of genuine emotion. And as the seasons go on, the animation of Morty's reactions becomes more restrained. Not because the animation quality declined, it actually got better technically, but because they're drawing a different Morty. A Morty who doesn't animate at maximum emotional expression anymore. A Morty who has learned to hold his face a little more still. The animators are doing character work through restraint. The Season 6 Morty face holds steadier than the Season 1 Morty face. It processes more quietly, it gives less away, and the combination of the restrained face and the quieter voice and the absence of the big physical scream reactions creates a composite effect that reads, correctly, as a person who has closed off. Not completely, not irreversibly, but meaningfully. The Season 7 Morty, visually and vocally, occupies less space than the Season 1 Morty. He takes up less room in the frame, which is accurate. He's learned to be smaller. Extended analysis, the fans who missed it. I want to say something that might be slightly uncomfortable. A lot of Rick and Morty fans, especially the fans who were there from the beginning, who loved the early seasons specifically, kind of wanted Morty to grow up. There were threads about it, forum posts, comments, people saying Morty's constant screaming and panicking and being overwhelmed was annoying, that it was a weak character trait, that it would be good when he toughened up and stopped being such a liability. And in some ways, the show heard that. Not in a direct, fans are unhappy, let's fix it way, but in the way that shows that run for a long time end up internalizing what they're perceived to be doing and adjust. The Morty who gets less space in later seasons, who screams less and handles things more, is partly the result of the show growing and maturing. But he's also partly a response to an audience that found Season 1 Morty annoying. And here's the thing I want to say about that. The audience wasn't wrong to find him annoying. He was annoying. Constant screaming is objectively irritating. Being around someone who panics at everything is exhausting. It makes sense that fans wanted him to calm down and get better. But get better and stop feeling things at full volume aren't the same request. The fans wanted a more capable Morty. What they might have gotten is a more defended one. And defended is not the same as better. Defended is just quieter. Extended analysis, Morty and Beth. Let me talk about Beth for a minute. Because Beth's relationship with Morty contains a version of the Scream story that's almost a preview. Beth is smart, like Rick. Ambitious, like Rick. Capable of emotional detachment that looks like strength and is sometimes something that went wrong. And what we know about Beth's childhood, across the series, is that Rick was absent for most of it. He left, he came back, he left again. The cycles of absence and return that he's now doing with Morty, Rick did them with Beth first. And Beth survived. And Beth is, in relevant ways, very much like Rick, which is a warning, not a prophecy. Not Morty will definitely become Rick or Beth. People aren't deterministic, but the pattern is there. Rick's presence, the specific combination of brilliance and unavailability and occasional overwhelming emotional generosity, followed by extended withdrawal, produces a specific response in the people who love him. It produces someone who learns to get their needs met in other ways, or someone who learns to have fewer needs. Beth went one direction. Morty is going a different direction. And where those directions lead is something the show is still, if it's being honest with itself, still figuring out. But the Beth data point is important, because Beth isn't emotionally destroyed. She's functional, she's capable, she has real love for her family. But there's something sealed off in Beth that you can trace back to Rick. And there's something increasingly sealed off in Morty that you can trace back to the same place. The father's unintentional legacy, showing up in the second generation. And now starting maybe in the third. Extended analysis, the screams we didn't hear. There's a category of scream I haven't talked about. The screams that happened between episodes. What happened to Morty in the time we didn't see? Not in other dimensions, not in alternative timelines, just in the regular space of a TV show where there are gaps between seasons and sometimes gaps between episodes. Morty, in the narrative, has been doing this for years, living with Rick, going on adventures, coming home to a family that's also going through its own things, going to school when he goes to school, having a life that exists between the moments the show focuses on. And in that off-screen life, things happen to Morty that we never saw, including screams we never heard. The Mind Blowers showed us some of them. Bad things from adventures that were too heavy to carry, so Rick removed them. But those weren't all of Morty's off-screen moments. Those were just the ones Rick decided he needed to take. What about the screams that didn't get taken? The ones Morty had to integrate on his own? What about the times something happened and there was no Rick to help and Morty had to just process it in his room alone without anyone knowing? What about the gradual accumulation of everything that didn't make it into any episode? The off-screen Morty is someone we never get to fully know. And the off-screen Morty is, in some ways, the most important one. Because the person you become in private is the person you actually are. And the person Morty has become in private, over years of adventures and recoveries and more adventures and less recovery, that person is showing up more and more in what we do see. The quieter Morty, the more managed Morty, the Morty who handles things. He was built in the gaps, in the spaces between episodes, in all the moments the show couldn't show us, in all the screams that nobody heard. Extended analysis, what comes next? The show is still going. New seasons, new episodes, new adventures. And the question that hangs over all of it, for anyone who's been paying attention to the Scream arc, is, where does Morty go from here? Not in terms of plot, in terms of this. In terms of the emotional availability we've been tracking. Is there a version of the Morty story where the screams come back? Where something happens that gets through the armor, that reaches the part of him that's been sealed off, that produces a scream that costs him something again, the way the early screams cost him something? It's possible. The show has always been capable of surprising emotional honesty when it wants to be. Rick Potion #9 proved that in Season 1. The Mind Blowers proved it in Season 3. Rick Mirai Jack proved it in Season 5. The machinery for genuine emotional devastation is still in the show. It just doesn't get used for Morty as often. But maybe there's a moment coming, in Season 8, in Season 9, somewhere, where something reaches Morty in a way that breaks through, where the managed competence cracks, and something underneath it shows. Maybe the armor has a weak spot. Maybe there's a scream left in him that even the years and the adventures and the accumulated numbness couldn't bury all the way. I hope so. Not because I want Morty to suffer, but because a scream means something still reaches him, and someone who can still be reached is someone who's still really there. Extended analysis. The freeze frame. Let me close with a thought experiment. You're watching the pilot, Season 1, Episode 1. Morty is screaming on the alien planet. Full body, full voice, completely overwhelmed. Freeze it. Now imagine you could show that exact frame to Season 7 Morty. What would he say? I think he'd be quiet for a long moment. And then, if we're lucky, if the show is being honest about where he's gotten to, he'd say something like, "Yeah, I remember that." Not, "That was me." Not, "I was so weak then." I remember that. The way you remember a feeling you used to have that you don't exactly have anymore. Not with judgment, not with superiority, with something closer to loss. Because Season 7 Morty can handle the alien planet now. He can handle it without screaming. But handling it and feeling it are different things. And the Season 1 kid in that freeze frame felt every single second of it. All the way to the bones. Which is terrifying. Which is also, when you look at it long enough, something kind of beautiful. He was alive in a way that's hard to replicate once the world becomes familiar. Once the strangeness wears off. Once you stop screaming. Final note. This video was never really about the screams. It was about what happens to a person when they stop making noise about the things that are too much for them. Morty Smith started this story at full volume. He was annoying. He was scared. He was loud and transparent and very, very present. And across 7 seasons, the volume went down. Not all at once. Gradually. Adventure by adventure, season by season, scream by scream. Until he got quiet. And the quiet is impressive. And the quiet is sad. And the quiet is Morty Smith, standing somewhere that would have destroyed him in Season 1, handling it without making a sound. The biggest tragedy isn't what happened to him. It's that he doesn't know anything happened. That's the thing about losing the scream. You stop being able to hear what's gone. Deep dive, season by season, scream count and context. Let's get specific. Not just about the emotional arc, but about the actual texture of what's happening across each season's scream landscape, because the distribution matters. Season 1 has what I'd estimate as the densest scream per episode ratio of any season. If you watch the pilot and then watch the finale back to back, you're hearing two very different volumes of Morty, but the finale is still loud by later standards. The screaming in Season 1 is so consistent that it starts to feel like part of the show's sonic identity. Background noise almost, something you stop consciously registering after a few episodes. That's important, because the show is doing something clever. It's establishing the scream as the default, as baseline, as what Morty is. So that when the scream starts disappearing, the absence feels wrong without you being able to immediately articulate why. You've been calibrated to a Morty who screams constantly, and then that calibration slowly shifts, and what you're left with is an uncanny sense that something has changed without knowing exactly what. Pilot, through 60 Minutes, is basically unbroken Morty scream territory. Even the episodes that are more summer-focused, Rixie Business, for instance, have Morty as a screaming presence in the background. He's reactive to pretty much everything. Season 2 is where the first quiet spaces appear, not in the screams themselves. Season 2 has some extremely loud Morty moments, including some of the most emotionally resonant screams in the show's run. But in between the screams, there are pauses that didn't exist in Season 1. Moments where something bad happens and Morty absorbs it, rather than immediately vocalizing it. Total Recall is a Season 2 episode that shows this clearly. There are things that happen in that episode, including the extremely dark Mr. Poopy Butthole moment, where the old Morty would have had a very loud, very immediate reaction. And the Season 2 Morty has a reaction that's more considered, more internal. He still expresses it, but there's a beat before the expression. One beat, tiny, easy to miss. But it wasn't there in Season 1. Season 3 is where the screams start to get categorically different. The Season 3 screams are angrier. They're also more situational. There are specific episodes with a lot of Morty noise, particularly the post-apocalyptic ones, and specific episodes where Morty is unusually quiet. Morty's mind-blowers being the obvious example. The consistency of Season 1 starts breaking down. You can no longer predict there will be several Morty screams in this episode based on genre cues. Season 3 is where the scream becomes optional. Not gone, not reduced dramatically, but optional in a way it wasn't before. Season 4 is a proper reduction. If you do a rough count, and I did, roughly, Season 4 has fewer total Morty scream moments than any previous season. Not fewer per episode exactly, because Season 4 has some very loud episodes. But the average episode has a Morty who is quieter, more frequently in the background, more often reacting to things without vocalizing the reaction. Season 4 Morty has developed what you'd call an inside voice, and he's using it more. Season 5 splits the difference in an interesting way. There are Season 5 episodes that are genuinely loud. Morty has some intense reactions in the premiere, in the Vat of Acid episode, in the finale. But there are also Season 5 episodes where Morty is so quiet that he basically disappears into the ensemble, where episodes go by without a single Morty scream. And those quiet episodes don't feel like they're shortchanging Morty. They feel like a Morty who has chosen to be quiet, which is a different thing from a Morty who was never going to scream in the first place. The choice is the scary part. Season 6 is where the quiet becomes the default. Not silence, exactly. Morty still reacts, still vocalizes, still has emotional responses that you can see and hear. But the default has flipped. Season 1 default was scream, with quiet as the exception. Season 6 default is quiet, with scream as the exception. A thing would have to be genuinely extraordinary to make Season 6 Morty scream. And the things that used to be extraordinary, alien planets, dimensional anomalies, existential threats, have stopped being extraordinary. They're just Wednesday. Season 7 takes the default and makes it law. Season 7 Morty has a controlled vocal register for almost everything. There are moments of surprise, moments of fear, moments of anger, but the full body, full voice, unmanaged scream of Season 1 is essentially absent. And the thing is, and I want to be fair here, some of that is the voice change. Harry Belden has a different instrument than Justin Roiland. The texture of his fear response is genuinely different, and that's not a criticism, that's just a reality of recasting. But the writers also leaned into a quieter Morty specifically, which suggests they were aware of the shift and were making a choice. They're writing a Morty who has arrived somewhere. Whether that somewhere is peace, or stillness, or numbness, or something in between, that's the question they're leaving open. But they're not writing the Season 1 Morty anymore. And I don't think they could, even if they wanted to. Deep dive. The relationship between confidence and silence. Here's something worth examining carefully, because it's easy to get wrong. When Morty goes quiet, is it because he's scared or because he's not? This sounds like a simple question. It's not. Season 1 Morty screams when he's scared. That's clear. That's straightforward. He's scared and he makes noise. Simple. But not screaming in later seasons could mean several different things. 1. Morty has genuinely become more capable and is handling things that used to scare him because they no longer constitute a real threat to his functioning. He's grown. He's competent. He's fine. 2. Morty is scared but has learned to suppress the fear response. He's just as afraid as he would have been in Season 1, but he's developed the ability to not show it. 3. Morty is genuinely not registering the fear because the thing that would have scared him has been normalized. Not because he's capable, but because repetition has dulled the threat response. 4. Some combination of all three, at different moments, in different proportions. And the problem is that from the outside, all 4 of these look pretty similar. A Morty who isn't screaming could be confident, suppressed, numb, or some layered combination. The show, to its credit, doesn't always clarify which one we're looking at. Sometimes it's clearly confidence. There are moments in Season 4 and 5 where Morty does something genuinely impressive without help, and the implication is clearly he has become capable. These are the moments that read as growth, and they're meant to. But there are other moments, quieter ones, more ambiguous ones, where the absence of the scream doesn't read as confidence. Where the absence of the scream reads as distance. Like Morty isn't scared because the thing happening to him isn't fully reaching him. And that difference is everything. Confidence without feeling is skill. Distance without feeling is something else. It's the question the show is brave enough to keep asking, even when it doesn't answer. Deep dive. The scream in comparison. Other characters let. Briefly compare Morty's arc to the other characters' emotional arcs to see if the scream pattern is unique to him or part of a larger pattern. Rick doesn't scream. Not in the fear sense. Occasionally in the expressive sense. Rick is loud sometimes. Rick yells sometimes. But the specific register of Morty's fear screams is entirely absent from Rick's character. Rick, we're told and shown, has already been through so much that the world doesn't frighten him in the way that would produce that scream. His equivalent of the scream is something much quieter and much worse. The depressive episodes, the moments of dark honesty, the post-Unity attempt at suicide. Rick's version of the scream is the places he goes when nobody's watching. Summer starts Season 1 as someone who doesn't scream. She's skeptical, she's teenage confident in a brittle way, she's not initially exposed to the adventures. When she becomes a participant, she adapts faster than Morty. Summer screams less across the entire series. Her arc is different. She comes to the adventures already somewhat defended, and the adventures add more defenses rather than stripping them away. Jerry screams in a completely different register. Jerry's screams are embarrassment, awkwardness, the specific social terror of being someone who wants to be seen as competent and constantly fails. Jerry's screaming is almost never fear. It's the scream of someone whose self-image is being violated. Beth barely screams. Beth's emotional life lives in sarcasm and deflection and occasional terrifying honesty. The scream that would expose how much she's been hurt by Rick's absence is sealed off somewhere. So Morty's scream arc is unique in the family. He's the only one who started out at maximum vulnerability and has been watching that vulnerability compress, which makes him the emotional center of the show in a way that none of the other characters are. He's the one we get to watch change, and the change we get to watch is the scream. Deep dive. The specific moment. In Rick Potion #9, I want to go back to this episode one more time, because I think it's more important than most people realize. Rick Potion #9 is Season 1, Episode 6, and it is, in my reading, the single most important episode for understanding Morty's arc. Not because it's the most dramatic, not because the stakes are highest, but because it's the moment where the scream becomes something new. Up until Rick Potion #9, Morty's screams are responses to things that might kill him, or hurt him, or at least frighten him. They're survival screams. Even the confused screams and the disgust screams have a self-preservation quality to them. They're about Morty's physical or psychological safety in a direct sense. Rick Potion #9 introduces a different kind of threat, the threat to continuity of self. When Morty watches himself dead in a garbage bag, when he helps Rick bury the version of himself that didn't survive, when he walks into a version of his home that isn't quite his home and looks at a family that isn't quite his family, what's being threatened isn't his physical safety. His physical self is fine. What's being threatened is his story. His understanding of himself as a continuous person with a past and a future and a stable identity. That kind of threat doesn't produce a survival scream. It produces the existential scream. And that existential scream, in Rick Potion #9, is the first scream in the show that points toward everything that's coming. Because all of the biggest emotional moments in Rick and Morty, the mind blowers, the vat of acid, Rick Mirai Jack, Evil Morty's departure, are about that same thing. They're about the threat to continuity of self, to the story of who Morty is, to the sense that he's a coherent person with a coherent experience. Rick Potion #9 establishes that this is the thing that gets to Morty deepest. Not physical danger, not even death, but the threat to the story of himself. And then, slowly, the show takes that scream away too. By later seasons, Morty can face threats to his own continuity, can have his consciousness scattered, can encounter his own corpse, can watch multiple versions of himself live and die without screaming. Because that threat has been normalized too. Even the deepest scream eventually gets buried. Deep dive, the people who watched him change. There's a character in Rick and Morty who I don't think gets enough credit. It's Rick's ship. Stay with me here. The ship has interacted with Morty across essentially the entire series. It's heard every scream, it's been present for most of the adventures. It has, as the show establishes, opinions about Morty that are not entirely positive. But the ship's attitude toward Morty changes across the seasons. In early seasons, the ship treats Morty as an irritant, a screaming, panicking presence that creates problems. The ship's contempt for Morty in early seasons is partly played for laughs, but also reflects how Morty reads to anyone with more experience than him, as underprepared and overwhelmed and kind of exhausting. By later seasons, the ship's relationship with Morty is different, less contemptuous, sometimes almost neutral, not warm. The ship doesn't suddenly like Morty, but the ship stops treating Morty as the obvious weak link, as the liability, as the one who's going to cause problems. And part of that is the ship recognizing competence. But part of it, and I think this is real, is that the ship is reacting to the absence of the scream. The scream is what made Morty legible as underprepared. The scream was the giveaway. The scream said, "This kid can't handle it," in a way that even the ship's sensors could pick up. When the scream goes away, the reading changes. The kid looks like he can handle it now. Maybe he can. Or maybe he's just learned to look like he can. Either way, the ship recalibrates. The world recalibrates. And the scream, having stopped, becomes something you only notice in retrospect. Deep dive, the question of agency. I want to address something that might be nagging at some people. Is this Morty's choice? Did Morty decide to change? Did he decide to get quieter, more managed, more capable of handling things without vocalizing the handling? Or did it happen to him? I think the answer is both, in the way that most significant character changes are both. Some of the changes were chosen. Morty made decisions to keep going with Rick, to push through things that were difficult, to develop the skills that made the screaming less necessary. Those were choices, not always fully informed choices, not always choices made with full understanding of what they'd cost, but choices. And some of the changes happened to him, in the way that enough exposure to anything eventually changes the way you perceive it. The scream that stopped happening because Morty got numb to the stimulus, that wasn't chosen. It was an adaptation, a thing his nervous system did without asking permission. And the tragedy, if it's a tragedy, is that Morty can't always tell the difference. He can't always identify which silences are chosen and which ones just happened. Which moments of not screaming are confidence and which ones are numbness. which parts of himself he decided to put away, and which parts got taken. That uncertainty is realistic. That uncertainty is, in fact, how it works for real people who go through real accumulations of experience. You look back and you try to figure out when you changed, and you can identify some of the moments. But not all of them, because a lot of the changing happens in the margins, in the gaps between screams, in the quiet. Deep Dive, the show that didn't know it was telling this story. A legitimate question. Did Rick and Morty intend this? Did the writers sit down and say, we're going to track Morty's emotional development through his scream pattern, and the arc is going to run from full-volume terror to managed silence, and the managed silence is going to be ambiguous in exactly this way? Almost certainly not entirely. Television doesn't usually work like that. Characters change because actors change and writers change and audience expectations change and the cultural moment shifts. Season 7 Rick and Morty was made by different people in a different world for an audience that has different expectations than Season 1 Rick and Morty. But the writers have clearly been paying attention. There are too many moments in the series that read as intentional engagement with this arc for it to be entirely coincidental. Morty's Mind Blowers is too precise. The Vat of Acid episode is too thematically focused on the cost of Morty's position. Rick Morai Jack has too much emotional care in how it handles Morty's response to Rick's backstory. Someone, at the table, was thinking about what all of this means for Morty. And tracking it. Not always consciously, not always with full intention, but the show has consistently returned to the question of what Morty is becoming, even when it doesn't announce that question explicitly. Which is actually the best kind of storytelling. The kind where the text doesn't explain itself, where the meaning is in what happens, not in the characters telling you what it means. The Scream arc wasn't the pitch, but it became the story anyway, and the story is better for being found rather than announced. Coda. One last thing. There's a moment I want to leave you with. It's not from a specific episode. It's from Season 1, but it could be from any of the first season's earlier episodes. One of those moments where Morty has just gotten through something genuinely terrifying, where the scream has died down and the adventure has reached a pause, where he's sitting in the back of the ship or standing in the garage or just catching his breath somewhere. And he's fine. Not fine like, that was nothing, fine like, I made it. It was a lot and I'm still alive and I'm okay. The relief of that fine has a quality to it that's specific to Season 1. It's full-bodied. It reaches all the way through him. You can see it in his shoulders relaxing and his face doing something that's halfway between exhausted and genuinely happy. He made it through something hard and he knows he made it and the knowing feels good. That feeling, the specific relief of genuine survival, the wholeness of it, is something that requires having fully felt the fear first. You can't have that relief without having had the scream. And later, Morty doesn't have that relief. He might have something like it. He might have the functional awareness that a situation has resolved. But the full body, made it through, genuine relief of Season 1, Morty requires the full body, didn't think I would, genuine terror of Season 1 Morty. You can't have one without the other. They're the same thing in two different forms. And somewhere along the way, Morty lost the ability to be that scared. Which means he also lost the ability to feel that relieved. The coin has two sides, and when you stop flipping it, you stop getting either. The quiet is impressive. The quiet keeps